AD1. Taboo Trade-Offs, PT3. In rising half-circles of dark stone, a great sea of upraised hands. The lords and ladies of the Wisengamot, in plum-colored robes marked with a silver W, stared down in stern rebuke at a young girl trembling in chains. If they had, in any particular ethical system, damned themselves, they clearly thought quite highly of themselves for having done so. Harry's breath was trembling in his chest. His dark side had come up with a plan, and then rotated itself back out again, because speaking too icily would not be to Hermione's advantage, a fact which the only half-cold Harry had somehow not realized. "The vote carries in favor," intoned the secretary, when all the tallying was done, and the upraised hands fell back down. "The Wisengamot recognizes the blood debt owed by Hermione Granger to House Malfoy for the attempted murder of its scion and ending of its line." Lucius Malfoy was smiling in grim satisfaction. "And now," said the white-maned wizard, "I say that her debt shall be paid." Harry clenched his fists beneath the bench and shouted, "By the debt owed from House Malfoy to House Potter." "Silence!" snapped the woman in too much pink makeup sitting next to Minister Fudge. "You've disrupted these proceedings quite enough already. Auras, escort him out." "Wait," said Augusta Longbottom from the top tier of seats. "What debt is this?" Lucius's hands whitened on his cane. "House Malfoy owes no debt to you. It wasn't the world's most solid hope. It was based on one newspaper article from a woman who'd been false memory charmed, but Rita Skeeter had seemed to find it plausible that Mr. Weasley had allegedly owed James Potter a debt because—" "I'm surprised you've forgotten," Harry said evenly. "Surely it was a cruel and painful period of your life, laboring under the imperious curse of he who must not be named, until you were freed of it by the efforts of House Potter. By my mother, Lily Potter, who died for it, and by my father, James Potter, who died for it, and by me, of course." There was a brief silence within the most ancient hall. "Why, what an excellent point, Mr. Potter," said the old witch who'd been identified as Madam Bones. "I, too, am quite surprised that Lord Malfoy would forget such a significant event. It must have been such a happy day for him." "Yes," said Augusta Longbottom. "He must have been so grateful." Madam Bones nodded. "House Malfoy could not possibly deny that debt, unless, perhaps, Lord Malfoy is to tell us that he has misremembered something. I should take quite a professional interest in that. We are always trying to improve our picture of those dark days." Lucius Malfoy's hands gripped the silver snake handle of his cane like he was about to strike with it, unleash whatever power it kept. Then the Lord Malfoy seemed to relax, and a chill smile came over his face. "Of course," he said easily. "I do confess I had not understood, but the child is quite correct. But I do not quite think the two debts cancel. House Potter was only trying to save itself. After all, not so," Dumbledore said from above. "And therefore," intoned Lucius Malfoy, "I demand monetary compensation as well for the redemption of the blood debt owed my son. That, too, is the law." Harry felt a strange inward flinch. That had also been in the newspaper article. Mr. Weasley had demanded an additional 10,000 galleons. "How much?" said the boy who lived. Lucius was still wearing the cold smile. 100,000 galleons. "If you have not that much in your vault, I suppose I must accept a promissory note for the remainder." A roar of protest went up from Dumbledore's side of the room. Even some of the plum-colored robes in the middle looked shocked. "Shall we put it to vote of the Wisengamot?" said Lucius Malfoy. "I think few of us would like to see the little murderess go free. By a show of hands, that additional compensation of 100,000 galleons would be required to cancel the debt." The clerk began tallying, but that vote was also clear. Harry stood there, breathing deeply. "You better not even have to think about this," Harry's inner Gryffindor said threateningly. "It's a major purchase," observed Ravenclaw. "We ought to spend a lot of time thinking about it. It shouldn't have been hard. It shouldn't have. £2 million was only money, and money was only worth what it could buy." It was strange how much psychological attachment you could have to only money, or how painful it could be to imagine losing a bank vault full of gold that you hadn't even imagined existed just 1 year earlier. "Kimball Kinnison wouldn't hesitate," said Gryffindor. "Seriously. Like, snap decision. What sort of hero are you? I already hate you just for having to think about it for longer than 50 milliseconds. This is real life," said Ravenclaw. Losing all your money is a lot more painful for real people in real life than in heroic books. What? Demanded Gryffindor. Whose side are you on? I wasn't advocating for a particular answer, said Ravenclaw. I was just saying it because it was true. Could 100,000 galleons be used to save more than one life if spent some other way? Said Slytherin. We have research to do, battles to fight. The difference between being 40,000 galleons rich and being 60,000 galleons in debt is not trivial. So we'll just use one of our ways to make money fast and earn it all back, said Hufflepuff. It's not certain those will work, said Slytherin, and a lot of them require starting cash. Personally, said Gryffindor, I vote that we save Hermione and then gang up and kill our inner Slytherin. The clerk's voice said that the tally had been recorded and the vote had passed. Harry's lips opened. I accept your offer, said Harry's lips, without any hesitation, without any decision having been made. Just as if the internal debate had been pretense and illusion, the true controller of the voice having been no part of it. Lucius Malfoy's mask of calm shattered, his eyes widened, he stared at Harry in sheer blank astonishment. His mouth had opened slightly, though he wasn't speaking, and if he was making any peculiar noises, it couldn't be heard over the roar of simultaneous gasps from the Wizengamot. A tap of stone silenced the crowd. No, said the voice of Dumbledore. Harry's head jerked around to stare at the ancient wizard. Dumbledore's lined face was pale. The silver beard was visibly trembling. He looked like he was in the final throes of a terminal illness. I'm sorry, Harry, but this choice is not yours, for I am still the guardian of your vault. What? Said Harry, too shocked to compose his reply. I cannot let you go into debt to Lucius Malfoy, Harry. I cannot. You do not know, you do not realize, Di. Harry didn't even know which part of himself had spoken. It might have been a unanimous vote, the pure rage and fury pouring through him. For an instant he thought that the sheer force of the anger might take magical wing and fly out to strike the headmaster, send him tumbling back dead from the podium. But when that mental voice had spoken, the old wizard was still standing there, gazing at Harry's long dark wand in his right hand, short black rod in his left. And Harry's eyes also went to the red golden bird with its claws resting on the shoulder of Dumbledore's black robes, silent when no phoenix should have been silent. Fox, Harry said, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. Can you scream at him for me? The fiery bird on the old wizard's shoulder didn't scream. Maybe the Wizengamot had demanded that a spell of silence be put on the creature, otherwise it probably would have been screaming the whole time. But Fox hit his master, one golden wing buffeting the old wizard's head. I cannot, Harry, the old wizard said, the agony clear in his voice. I am doing as I must do. And Harry knew then, as he looked at the red golden bird, what he had to do as well. It should have been obvious from the beginning, that solution. Then I too will do what I must, Harry said up to Dumbledore, as though the two of them stood alone in the room. You do realize that, don't you? The old wizard shook his trembling head. You will change your mind when you are older. I'm not talking about that, Harry said, his voice still strange in his own ears. I mean that I will not allow Hermione Granger to be eaten by Dementors under any circumstances, period, regardless of what any law says, and no matter what I have to do to stop it. Do I still need to spell it out? A strange male voice spoke from somewhere far away. Be sure that the girl is taken directly to Azkaban and put under extra guard. Harry waited, staring at the old wizard, and then spoke again. I will go to Azkaban, Harry said to the old wizard, as though they stood alone in the world, before Hermione can be taken there and start snapping my fingers. It may cost me my life, but by the time she gets there, there won't be an Azkaban anymore. Some members of the Wizengamot gasped in surprise. Then a greater number started laughing. How would you even get there, little boy? Someone said, from among those who were laughing. I have my ways of going places, said the boy's distant voice. Harry kept his eyes on Dumbledore, on the old wizard staring at him in shock. Harry didn't look directly at Fawkes, didn't give his plan away. But in his mind he prepared to summon the Phoenix to transport him, prepared to fill his mind with light and fury, to call for the Firebird with all his might. He might have to do it upon the instant if Dumbledore pointed his wand. Would you truly? The old wizard said to Harry, also as if the two of them stood alone in the room. The room went silent again as everyone stared in shock at the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, who seemed to be taking the mad threat completely seriously. The old wizard's eyes were locked only on Harry. Would you risk everything, only for her? Yes, Harry said back in reply. That's the wrong answer, said Slytherin. Seriously, but it's the true answer. You will not see reason, said the old wizard. Apparently not, Harry said back. The gazes stayed locked. This is terrible folly, said the old wizard. I am aware of this, answered the hero. Now get out of my way. Strange light glinted in the ancient blue eyes. As you will, Harry Potter, but know that this is not over. The rest of the world faded back into existence. I withdraw my objection, said the old wizard. Harry Potter may do as he wishes. And the Wizengamot exploded in a roar of shock, only to be silenced by a final tap of the stone rod. Harry turned his head back to look at Lord Malfoy, who looked like he'd seen a cat turn into a person and start eating other cats. To call the look confused did not begin to describe it. You would truly, Lucius Malfoy said slowly, you would truly pay 100,000 galleons to save one mudblood girl. I think there's about 40,000 in my Gringotts vault, Harry said. It was strange how that was still causing more internal pain than the thought of taking an over 50% risk to his life to destroy Azkaban. As for the other 60,000, what are the rules exactly? It comes due when you graduate Hogwarts, the old wizard said from high above. But Lord Malfoy has certain rights over you before then, I fear. Lucius Malfoy stood motionless, frowning down at Harry. Who is she to you, then? What is she to you, that you would pay so much to keep her from harm? My friend, the boy said quietly. Lucius Malfoy's eyes narrowed. By the report I received, you cannot cast the Patronus charm, and Dumbledore knows this. The power of a single Dementor nearly killed you. You would not dare venture near Azkaban in your own person. That was in January, said Harry. This is April. Lucius Malfoy's eyes remained cool and calculating. You pretend you can destroy Azkaban, and Dumbledore pretends to believe it. Harry did not reply. The white-haired man turned slightly toward the center of the half-circle as though to address the greater Wizengamot. I withdraw my offer, shouted the Lord of Malfoy. I will not accept the debt to House Potter in payment, not even for 100,000 galleons. The girl's blood debt to House Malfoy stands. Again the roar of many voices. Dishonorable, someone cried. You acknowledge the debt to House Potter, and yet you would, and then that voice cut off. I acknowledge the debt, but the law does not strictly oblige me to accept it in cancellation, said Lord Malfoy with a grim smile. The girl is no part of House Potter. The debt I owe House Potter is no debt to her. As for the dishonor, Lucius Malfoy paused. As for the grave shame I feel at my ingratitude toward the Potters, who have done so much for me, Lucius Malfoy bowed his head. May my ancestors forgive me. Well, boy, called the scarred man sitting at Lord Malfoy's right hand. Go and destroy Azkaban then. I'd like to see that, said another voice. Will you be selling tickets? It went without saying that Harry didn't pick this particular moment to give up. The girl is no part of House Potter. He had, in fact, seen the obvious way out of the dilemma almost instantly. It might have taken him longer if he hadn't recently overheard a number of conversations between older Ravenclaw girls and read a certain number of Quibbler stories. He was nonetheless having trouble accepting it. This is ridiculous, said a part of Harry which had just dubbed itself the internal consistency checker. Our actions here are completely incoherent. First, you feel less emotional reluctance to risk your bloody life and probably die for Hermione than to part with a stupid heap of gold. And now you're balking just at getting married. System error. You know what? Said internal consistency checker. You're stupid. I didn't say no, thought Harry. I was just saying system error. I vote for destroying Azkaban, said Gryffindor. It needs to be done anyway. Really, really stupid, said internal consistency checker. Oh, screw this. I'm assuming control of our body. The boy took a deep breath and opened his mouth. By this point, Harry Potter had entirely forgotten the existence of Professor McGonagall, who had been sitting there this whole time, undergoing a number of interesting changes of facial expression, which Harry had not been looking at because he was distracted. It would have been overly harsh to say that Harry had forgotten her because he did not consider her a PC. It could be more kindly said that Professor McGonagall was not visibly a solution to any of his current problems, and therefore she was not part of the universe. So Harry, who at this point had a fair amount of adrenaline in his bloodstream, startled and jumped quite visibly when Professor McGonagall, her eyes now blazing with impossible hope and the tears on her cheek half dried, leapt to her feet and cried, "With me, Mr. Potter," and without waiting for a reply, tore down the stairs that led to the bottom platform where waited a chair of dark metal. It took a moment, but Harry ran after, though it took him longer to reach the bottom, after Professor McGonagall vaulted half the stairs with a strange cat-like motion and landed with the astonished-looking Auror trio already pointing their wands at her. "Miss Granger," cried Professor McGonagall, "can you speak yet?" Much as with Professor McGonagall, there was a certain sense in which it could be said that Harry had forgotten about the existence of Hermione Granger, because Harry had been tilting his neck back to look upward rather than downward, and because he hadn't considered her a solution to any of his current problems. Though it was hardly certain, in fact it wasn't at all probable, that Harry remembering to look at Hermione or think about what she must be feeling would have helped anything in the slightest. Harry reached the bottom of the stairs and saw Hermione Granger full on without thinking, without being able to help himself. Harry shut his eyes, but he'd seen. Her school robes around her neck, soaked all the way through with tears, the way she'd been looking away from him. And the eye of memory and sympathy, which could not be shut, which could not look away, knew that Hermione had recounted the worst shame of her life in front of the nobility of magical Britain and Professor McGonagall and Dumbledore and Harry, and then been sentenced to Azkaban, where she would be exposed to darkness and cold and all her worst memories until she went mad and died. And then she'd heard that Harry was going to give away all his money and go into debt to save her, and maybe even sacrifice his life, and with the Dementor standing only a few paces behind her, she hadn't said anything. "Why, yes," whispered the voice of Hermione Granger. "I see, can talk." Harry opened his eyes again and saw her face, now looking at him. It didn't say anything like what he thought Hermione was feeling. Faces couldn't say anything that complicated. All facial muscles could do was contort themselves into knots. Harry, I'm so. Shut up," Harry suggested. Sorry. If you'd never met me on the train, you wouldn't be in any trouble right now. So shut up," said Harry Potter. "Both of you stop being silly," Professor McGonagall said in her firm Scottish accent. It was strange how much that helped. "Mr. Potter, hold out your wand so that Miss Granger's fingers can touch it. Miss Granger, repeat after me. Upon my life and magic." Harry did as he was bid, thrusting his wand forward to touch Hermione's fingers, and then Hermione's faltering voice said, "Upon my life and magic." "I swear service to the House of Potter," said Professor McGonagall. And Hermione, without waiting for any further instructions, said, the words spilling out of her in a rush, "I swear service to the House of Potter, to obey its master or mistress, and stand at their right hand, and fight at their command, and follow where they go, until the day I die." All those words had been blurted out in a desperate gasp before Harry could have thought or said anything if he'd been mad enough to interrupt. "Mr. Potter, repeat these words," said Professor McGonagall. "I, Harry, heir and last scion of the Potters, accept your service until the end of the world and its magic." Harry took a breath and said, "I, Harry, heir and last scion of the Potters, accept your service until the end of the world and its magic." "That's it," said Professor McGonagall. "Well done." Harry looked up and saw that the entire Wisengamot, whose existence he'd forgotten, was staring at them. And then Minerva McGonagall, who was head of House Gryffindor, even if she didn't always act like it, looked up high above at where Lucius Malfoy stood, and she said to him before the entire Wisengamot, "I regret every point I ever gave you in Transfiguration, you vile little worm." Whatever Lucius was about to say in reply was silenced by a tap of the short rod in Dumbledore's hand. "Ahem," said the old wizard from his podium of dark stone. "This session has carried on quite considerably, and if it is not dismissed soon, some of us may miss their entire luncheon. The law of this matter is clear. You have already voted on the terms of the bargain, and Lord Malfoy cannot legally decline it. As we have far exceeded our allotted time, I now, in accordance with the last decision of the survivors of the 88th Wisengamot, adjourn this session." The old wizard tapped the rod of dark stone 3 times. "You fools!" shouted Lucius Malfoy. The white hair was shaking as though in a wind, the face beneath was pale with fury. "Do you think you'll get away with what you've done today? Do you think that girl can try to murder my son and escape unscathed? The toad-like pink makeup woman, whose name Harry could no longer remember, was standing up from her seat. Why, of course not, she said with a sickening smile. After all, the girl is still a murderess, and I think the Ministry shall be watching her affairs quite closely. It hardly seems wise that she should be allowed to wander the streets. After all, Harry was fed up at this point. Without waiting to listen, Harry turned on his heel and strode forward in long steps toward the horror only he could truly see, the absence of color and space, the wound in the world, above which floated a tattered cloak, most imperfectly guarded by a running moonlit squirrel and fluttering silver sparrow. His dark side had also noticed, when it was looking through the entire room for anything that could possibly be used as a weapon, that the enemy had been foolish enough to bring a Dementor into Harry's presence. That was a powerful weapon indeed, and one that Harry might wield better than its supposed masters. There had been a time in Azkaban when Harry had told 12 Dementors to turn and go, and they had gone. The Dementors are death, and the Patronus charm works by thinking about happy thoughts instead of death. If Harry's theory was correct, that one sentence would be all it took to pop the Aura's Patronus charms like a soap bubble, and ensure that nobody within reach of his voice could cast another one. I am going to cancel the Patronus charms and prevent any more Patronuses from being cast. And then my Dementor, flying faster than any broomstick, is going to kiss everyone here who voted to send a 12-year-old girl to Azkaban. Say that, to set up the if-then expectation and wait for people to understand and laugh. Then speak the fatal truth, and when the Aura's Patronuses winked out to prove the point, either people's anticipations of the mindless void or Harry's threat of its destruction would make the Dementor obey. Those who had sought to compromise with the darkness would be consumed by it. It was the other solution his dark side had devised. Ignoring the gasps rising from behind him, Harry crossed the radius of the Patronuses, strode to a single pace from death. Its unhindered fear burst around him like a whirlpool, like stepping next to the sucking drain of some huge bathtub emptying out its water. But with the false Patronuses no longer obscuring the level on which they interacted, Harry could reach the Dementor even as it could reach him. Harry looked straight into the pulling vacuum, and the earth among the stars all his triumph at saving Hermione. Someday the reality of which you are a shadow will cease to exist. Harry took all the silver emotion that fueled his Patronus charm and shoved it at the Dementor, and expected Death's shadow to flee from him. And as Harry did that, he flung his hands up and shouted boo. The void retreated sharply away from Harry until it came up against the dark stone behind. In the hall there was a deathly silence. Harry turned his back on the empty void and looked up at where the Toad Woman stood. She was pale beneath the pink makeup, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "I make you this one offer," said the boy who lived. "I never learn that you've been interfering with me or any of mine, and you never find out why the unkillable soul-eating monster is scared of me. Now sit down and shut up." The Toad Woman fell back down to her bench without a word. Harry looked further up. "Riddle, Lord Malfoy," the boy who lived shouted across the most ancient hall. "I know you weren't in Ravenclaw, but try to answer this one anyway. What destroys Dark Lords, frightens Dementors, and owes you 60,000 galleons?" For an instant Lord Malfoy stood there with eyes slightly widened. Then his face fell back into calm scorn, and his voice spoke coolly in reply. "Are you openly threatening me, Mr. Potter?" "I'm not threatening you," said the boy who lived. "I'm scaring you. There's a difference." "Enough, Mr. Potter," said Professor McGonagall. "We shall be late for afternoon transfiguration as it is. And do come back here. You're still terrifying that poor Dementor." She turned to the Auras. "Mr. Kleiner, if you would." Harry strode back to them as the Aura addressed moved forward and pressed a short rod of dark metal to the dark metal chair, muttering an inaudible word of dismissal. The chains slithered back as smoothly as they had come forth, and Hermione pushed herself out of the chair as fast as she could, and half ran and half staggered forward a few steps. Harry held out his arms, and Hermione half jumped, half fell into Professor McGonagall's arms, beginning to sob hysterically. "HMPFH," said a voice inside Harry. "I kind of thought we'd earned that one ourselves." "Oh, shut up." Professor McGonagall was holding Hermione so firmly that you might have thought it was a mother holding her daughter, or maybe granddaughter. After a few moments Hermione's sobs slowed. and then stopped. Professor McGonagall suddenly shifted her stance and grabbed onto her more tightly. The girl's hands were dangling limply now, and her eyes were closed. "She'll be fine, Mr. Potter," Professor McGonagall said softly in Harry's direction, without looking at him. "She just needs a few hours in one of Madame Pomfrey's beds." "All right, then," Harry said. "Let's get her to Madame Pomfrey's." "Yes," said Dumbledore as he descended to the bottom of the dark stone stairs. "Let us all go home, indeed." His blue eyes were locked on Harry as hard as sapphires. The lords and ladies of the Wisengamot are departing their wooden benches, leaving as they came, looking rather nervous. The vast majority are thinking the Dementor was frightened of the boy who lived. Some of the shrewder ones are already wondering how this will affect the delicate power balance of the Wisengamot if a new piece has appeared upon the game board. Almost none are thinking anything along the lines of, "I wonder how he did that." This is the truth of the Wisengamot. Many are nobles, many are wealthy magnates of business. A few came by their status in other ways. Some of them are stupid. Most are shrewd in the realms of business and politics, but their shrewdness is circumscribed. Almost none have walked the path of a powerful wizard. They have not read through ancient books, scrutinized old scrolls, searching for truths too powerful to walk openly, and disguised in conundrums, hunting for true magic among 100 fantastic fairy tales. When they are not looking at a contract of debt, they abandon what shrewdness they possess and relax with some comfortable nonsense. They believe in the Deathly Hallows, but they also believe that Merlin fought the dread to Toro and imprisoned the Ree. They know, because that too is part of the standard legend, that a powerful wizard must learn to distinguish the truth among 100 plausible lies. But it has not occurred to them that they might do the same. Why not? Why, indeed, would wizards with enough status and wealth to turn their hands to almost any endeavor choose to spend their lives fighting over lucrative monopolies on ink importation? The headmaster of Hogwarts would hardly see the question. Of course, most people should not be powerful wizards, just as most people should not be heroes. The defense professor could explain at great and cynical length why their ambitions are so trivial. To him, too, there is no puzzle. Only Harry Potter, for all the books he has read, is unable to understand. To the boy who lived, the life choices of the lords and ladies seem incomprehensible, not what a good person would do, nor yet an evil person either. Now which of the three is most wise? For whatever reason, then, most of the Wisengamot has never walked the path that leads to powerful wizardry. They do not seek out what is hidden. For them, there is no why, there is no explanation, there is no causality. The boy who lived, who was already halfway into the magisterium of legend, has now been promoted all the way there. And it is a brute fact, simple and unexplained, that the boy who lived frightens Dementors. 10 years earlier, they were told that a 1-year-old boy defeated the most terrible Dark Lord of their generation, perhaps the most evil Dark Lord ever to live. And they just accepted that too. You are not meant to question that sort of thing, they know in some unspoken way. If the most terrible Dark Lord in history confronts an innocent baby, why, how could he not be vanquished? The rhythm of the play demands it. You are supposed to applaud, not stand up from your seat in the audience and say, "Why?" It is just the story's conceit, that in the end the Dark Lord is brought down by a little child. And if you are going to question that, you might as well not attend the play in the first place. It does not occur to them to second-guess the application of such reasoning to the events they have seen with their own eyes in the most ancient hall. Indeed, they are not consciously aware that they are using story reasoning on real life. As for scrutinizing the boy who lived with the same careful logic they would use on a political alliance or a business arrangement, what brain would associate to that when a part of the legendary magisterium is at hand? But there are very few, seated on those wooden benches, who do not think like this. There are certain few of the Wisengamot who have read through half-disintegrated scrolls and listened to tales of things that happened to someone's brother's cousin, not for entertainment, but as part of a quest for power and truth. They have already marked the night of Godric's Hollow, as reported by Albus Dumbledore, as an anomalous and potentially important event. They have wondered why it happened, if it did happen, or if not, why Dumbledore is lying. And when an 11-year-old boy rises up and says, "Lucius Malfoy," in that cold adult voice, and goes on to speak words one simply would not expect to hear from a first year in Hogwarts. They do not allow the fact to slip into the lawless blurs of legends and the premises of plays. They mark it as a clue. They add it to the list. This list is beginning to look somewhat alarming. It doesn't particularly help when the boy yells boo at a Dementor, and the decaying corpse presses itself flat against the opposite wall, and its horrible ear-hurting voice rasps, "Make him go away." 82. Taboo Trade-Offs Final. Phoenix travel was a sensation entirely unlike apparition or portkeys. You caught on fire, you definitely felt yourself catching on fire, even though there was no pain, and instead of burning to ashes, the fire burned all the way through you and you became fire, and then you went out in one place and blazed up in another. It didn't sicken the stomach like portkeys or apparition, but it was a rather unnerving experience nonetheless. If the underlying truth of Phoenix travel really was becoming a specific instantiation of a more general fire, then that seemed to hint you could potentially burn anywhere, even in the distant past, or in another universe, or in two places at once. You might go out in one place and blaze up in 100 others, and the you who arrived at Hogwarts would never know the difference. Though Harry had read what he could about phoenixes, trying to figure out how to get one of his own, and there'd been no hint of anything remotely like that capability. Harry caught fire and went out and blazed up somewhere else, and just like that he, and the headmaster, and the unconscious form of Hermione Granger held in the headmaster's arms, were occupying another place, with Fawkes above them all. A calm, warm room of bright stone columns, skylit on all four sides, populated by white beds in long rows, four of which had silencing veils drawn around them, and the rest empty. In one corner of Harry's vision, a surprised-looking Madame Pomfrey was turning toward them. Dumbledore seemed to pay the senior healer no heed as he carefully laid down Hermione on an unoccupied white bed. From a distant corner there was a flash of green, and from out of a fireplace strode Professor McGonagall, brushing herself off slightly from the flue ashes. The old wizard turned from the bed and reached one of his arms around Harry again, and then the boy, who lived, and his wizard vanished in another burst of fire. When Harry had fully lit up again, he was standing in the headmaster's office, amid the noises of a dozen inexplicable gadgets. The young boy took a step away from the old wizard, and then turned on him, emerald and sapphire eyes meeting. The two of them did not speak for a time, looking at each other, as though all they had to speak could be said only by stares, and not said in any other way. In time the boy enunciated words slowly and precisely. "I cannot believe that a phoenix is still upon your shoulder. The phoenix chooses but once," said the old wizard. "They might perhaps leave a master who chooses evil over good. They will not leave a master forced to choose between one good and another. Phoenixes are not arrogant. They know the limits of their own wisdom. Stern indeed, that ancient gaze. Unlike you, Harry. Choose between one good and another," Harry echoed flatly. "Like Hermione Granger's life versus 100,000 galleons." The rage and indignation Harry wanted to put into his voice wasn't quite there. For some reason, maybe because, "You are hardly in a position to speak to me of that, Harry Potter." The headmaster's voice was deceptively soft. "Or what was that look of reluctance that I saw upon your face, there in the most ancient hall?" The sense of inward hollowness grew worse. "I was looking for other alternatives," Harry bit out. "Some way to save her that didn't lose the money." "Wow," said Ravenclaw. "You just told an outright lie. Not only that, I think you actually believed it for the seconds it took to say it. That's kinda scary." "Is that what you were thinking, Harry?" The blue eyes were keen, and there was a terrifying moment when Harry wondered if the world's most powerful wizard could see right past his occlumency barriers. "Yes," Harry said. "I flinched away from the pain of losing all the money in my vault. But I did it. That's what counts." And you, the indignation that had faltered out of Harry's voice returned. "You actually put a price on Hermione Granger's life, and you put it below 100,000 galleons." "Oh," the old wizard said softly. "And what price do you put on a life then? 1,000,000 galleons? Are you familiar with the economic concept of replacement value?" The words were spilling from Harry's lips almost faster than he could consider them. "Hermione's replacement value is infinite. There's nowhere I can go to buy another one. Now you're just talking mathematical nonsense, said Slytherin. Ravenclaw, back me up here. Is Minerva's life also of infinite worth? The old wizard said harshly. Would you sacrifice Minerva to save Hermione? Yes and yes, Harry snapped. That's part of Professor McGonagall's job, and she knows it. Then Minerva's value is not infinite, said the old wizard, for all that she is loved. There can only be one king upon a chessboard, Harry Potter, only one piece that you will sacrifice any other piece to save. And Hermione Granger is not that piece. Make no mistake, Harry Potter, this day you may well have lost your war. And if the old wizard's words hadn't hit quite so hard and quite so close to home, Harry might not have said what he said then. Lucius was right, Harry ground out. You never had a wife. You never had a daughter. You've never had anything but war. The old wizard's left hand closed hard upon Harry's wrist, bony fingers digging into the still-developing muscle of Harry's arm. And for a moment Harry was paralyzed with the shock of it. He had forgotten what it meant that adults were stronger. Albus Dumbledore did not seem to notice. He only turned, dragging Harry with him, and moved forward in hard steps toward the wall of the room. Phoenix's price. Harry was pulled up along the black stairs. Phoenix's fate. The room of black pedestals, silver light falling on shattered wands. You think, yelled Harry after his lips unlocked, that you can win any argument just by standing here. The old wizard ignored him, dragging Harry across the room. His right hand, no longer holding his wand, grabbed up a vial of silver fluid. Harry blinked in shock. The vial of silver fluid had been standing next to a picture of Dumbledore, or so it had appeared to Harry in the brief moment before he was dragged past. Past the end of all the pedestals, at the farthest part of the room, rose a great stone basin with runes carved into it that Harry didn't recognize. The center was a shallow depression filled with transparent liquid, and into this the old wizard dumped the canister of silver fluid, which at once began to spread out, to swirl, to set the entire basin glowing eerie white. The old wizard's hand let go of Harry's arm and gestured to the glowing basin, commanding harshly, "Look." As requested, Harry stared at the glowing water. "Put your head into the pensive, Harry Potter." The old wizard's voice was stern. Harry had heard that word before, but he couldn't remember where. "What does this do, memories?" the old wizard said. "You will see my memory, my oath that it is safe. Now look into the pensive, Ravenclaw, if you still care anything at all for your precious truth." That was a request that Harry could not deny, and he stepped forward and thrust his head into the glowing water. Harry was sitting behind the desk in the headmaster's office of Hogwarts, and his wrinkled hands that clutched at his head were spotted with age and white hairs. "He is all that I have," wept a voice. Very strange was Dumbledore's voice, as Dumbledore himself remembered it. From the inside it seemed far less stern and wise. "The last of my family, all that I have left." No emotion had been allowed to pass through the pensive, only the physical sensation of seeming to speak the words. Harry heard the utter desolation in Dumbledore's words, the sounds that seemed to come from Harry's own throat, but Harry did not feel it beyond the hearing. "You've got no choice," said a harsh voice. The eyes moved. The field of vision jumped to a man that Harry didn't recognize, in clothing tinged with aura crimson, but made of solid leather with many pockets. His right eye was overlarge, with an electric blue pupil that constantly darted and moved. "You cannot ask this of me, Alistair." Dumbledore's voice was wild. "Not this, anything but this." "I'm not asking," growled the man. "Valdi's the one who's asking, and you're going to tell him no." "For money, Alistair." Dumbledore's voice was begging. "Only for money. You ransom Aberforth, you lose the war," the man said sharply. "That's simple. 100,000 galleons is nearly all we've got in the war chest, and if you use it like this, it won't be refilled." "What'll you do? Try to convince the Potters to empty their vault like the Longbottoms already did? Valdi's just going to kidnap someone else and make another demand. Alice, Minerva, anyone you care about, they'll all be targets if you pay off the Death Eaters. That's not the lesson you should be trying to teach them. If I do this, I will have no one. No one." Dumbledore's voice broke. The world tilted as the outlooking head fell down into the ancient hands, and awful sounds came from Not Harry's throat as he began to sob like a child. "Shall I tell Valdi's messenger no?" said Alistair's voice, now strangely gentle. "You don't have to do it yourself, old friend." "No, I will say it myself. I must. The memory ended with a shock, and Harry ripped his head out of the glowing water, gasping as though he'd been deprived of air. The transition between scenes, between decade-old reality and present moment, was another jolt to Harry's mind. In some fashion, his immersion in the past had unanchored him. The broken old man sobbing in his office had been another person in another era. Harry had understood that much. Someone softer, before it had all vanished like dissipating smoke, returning the now, the present day. Terrible and stern stood the ancient wizard, like he was carven from stone, beard woven of thread like iron, half-moon glasses like mirrors, and the pupils behind as sharp and unyielding as black diamond. "Do you also wish to see my brother as he died under the Cruciatus?" said Albus Dumbledore. "Voldemort sent me that memory as well." And that, Harry was having trouble producing a voice for the growing sickness in his chest. That was when the words seemed to burn in his throat, as the awful knowledge dawned on him, the horrible understanding. That was when you burned Narcissa Malfoy alive in her own bedroom. Albus Dumbledore's gaze was cold as he answered. To that question, only a fool would say yea or nay. What matters is that the Death Eaters believe I killed her, and that belief kept safe the families of all who served the Order of the Phoenix until this day. Now do you understand what you have done? What you have done to your friends, Harry Potter, and to any that stand with you? The old wizard seemed to grow still taller and more terrible as his voice rose louder. You have made them all targets, and targets they will remain, until you prove, the only way it can be proven, that you are no longer willing to pay such prices. And is it true? Harry said. There was a buzzing sensation filling him, his body growing more distant. What Draco said, that Narcissa Malfoy never got her hands dirty, that she was only Lucius's wife. She was an enabler, I get that, but I can't back that deserving being burned alive. Nothing less would have convinced them that I was done with hesitation. The old wizard's voice brooked no question and no refusal. Always I was too reluctant to do as I must. Always it was others who paid the cost of my mercy. So Alistair told me from the beginning, but I did not listen to him. You, I expect, shall prove better at such decisions than I. I'm surprised, Harry said, amazed that his voice was almost steady. I would have expected the Death Eaters to go after another light family and start a cycle of escalating retaliation if you didn't get them all with your first strike. If my opponent had been Lucius, perhaps. Dumbledore's eyes were like stones. I am told that Voldemort laughed at the news and proclaimed to his Death Eaters that I had finally grown and was at last a worthy opponent. Perhaps he was right. After the day I condemned my brother to his death, I began to weigh those who followed me, balancing them one against another, asking who I would risk and who I would sacrifice, to what end. It was strange how many fewer pieces I lost, once I knew what they were worth. Harry's jaw seemed locked, like it took a massive effort to make his lips move. But then it's not like Lucius was deliberately taking Hermione for ransom, Harry's voice said thinly. From Lucius's perspective, someone else broke the truce first. So with that in mind, how many galleons was Hermione worth exactly? Leaving aside the Danegeld thing, if it was just some ordinary threat to her life, how much should I have paid to save her? 10,000 galleons. 5,000. The old wizard did not answer. It's a funny thing, Harry said, his voice wavering like something seen through water. Do you know, the day I went in front of the Dementor, what my worst memory was? It was my parents dying. I heard their voices and everything. The old wizard's eyes widened behind the half-moon glasses. And here's the thing, Harry said. Here's the thing I've been thinking about over and over. The Dark Lord gave Lily Potter the chance to walk away. He said that she could flee. He told her that dying in front of the crib wouldn't save her baby. Step aside, foolish woman, if you have any sense in you at all. An awful chill came over Harry as he spoke those words from his own lips, but he shook it off and continued. And afterward I kept thinking, I couldn't seem to stop myself from thinking, wasn't the Dark Lord right? If only Mother had stepped away. She tried to curse the Dark Lord, but it was suicide. She had to have known that it was suicide. Her choice wasn't between her life and mine. Her choice was for herself to live, or for both of us to die. If she'd only done the logical thing and walked away, I love Mum too, but Lily Potter would be alive right now and she would be my mother. Tears were blurring Harry's eyes. Only now I understand. I know what Mother must have felt. She couldn't step aside from the crib. She couldn't. Love doesn't walk away. It was like the old wizard had been struck by a chisel that shattered him straight down the middle. "What have I said?" the old wizard whispered. "What have I said to you?" "I don't know," shouted Harry. "I wasn't listening either." I'm sorry, Harry, the old wizard pressed his hands to his face, and Harry saw that Albus Dumbledore was weeping. "I should not have said such things to you. I should not have resented your innocence." Harry stared at the wizard for another second, and then Harry turned and marched out of the black room, down the stairs, through the office. "I really don't know why you're still on his shoulder," Harry said to Fawkes. Out the oaken door and into the endlessly turning spiral. Harry had arrived in the Transfiguration classroom before anyone else, before even Professor McGonagall. There was Charms class earlier for his year, but that he hadn't even bothered trying to attend. Whether Professor McGonagall would make today's class, he didn't know. There was something ominous about all the empty desks beside him, the absence at the board, as if he stood alone in Hogwarts with all his friends departed. According to the class schedule, today's lesson was on sustained transfigurations, all the rules of which Harry had learned by heart back when he was transfiguring a huge rock into the small diamond that shone on his pinky finger. It would be a theoretical subject, rather than practical, for the rest of the class, which was a pity, because he could have used a dose of Transfiguration's trance. Harry noted distantly that his hand was trembling, to the point where he had trouble undoing the pouch's drawstring as he drew forth the Transfiguration textbook. "You were monstrously unfair to Dumbledore," said the voice Harry had been calling Slytherin, only now it also seemed to be the voice of economic sensibility and maybe also conscience. Harry's eyes dropped down to his textbook, but the section was so familiar it might as well have been a blank parchment. Dumbledore fought a war against a Dark Lord who deliberately set out to break him in the cruelest possible way. He had to choose between losing his war and his brother. Albus Dumbledore knows. He learned in the worst possible way that there are limits to the value of one life, and it almost broke his sanity to admit it. But you, Harry Potter, you already knew better. "Shut up," the boy whispered to the empty Transfiguration classroom, though there was nobody there to hear it. You'd already read about Philip Tetlock's experiments on people asked to trade off a sacred value against a secular one, like a hospital administrator who has to choose between spending $1 million on a liver to save a 5-year-old and spending the $1 million to buy other hospital equipment or pay physician salaries. And the subjects in the experiment became indignant and wanted to punish the hospital administrator for even thinking about the choice. Do you remember reading about that, Harry Potter? Do you remember thinking how very stupid that was, since if hospital equipment and doctor salaries didn't also save lives, there would be no point in having hospitals or doctors? Should the hospital administrator have paid £1 billion for that liver, even if it meant the hospital going bankrupt the next day? "Shut up," the boy whispered. Every time you spend money in order to save a life with some probability, you establish a lower bound on the monetary value of a life. Every time you refuse to spend money to save a life with some probability, you establish an upper bound on the monetary value of life. If your upper bounds and lower bounds are inconsistent, it means you could move money from one place to another and save more lives at the same cost. So if you want to use a bounded amount of money to save as many lives as possible, your choices must be consistent with some monetary value assigned to a human life. If not, then you could reshuffle the same money and do better. How very sad, how very hollow the indignation of those who refuse to say that money and life can ever be compared, when all they're doing is forbidding the strategy that saves the most people for the sake of pretentious moral grandstanding. You knew that, and you still said what you did to Dumbledore. You deliberately tried to hurt Dumbledore's feelings. He's never tried to hurt you, Harry Potter, not once. Harry's head dropped into his hands. Why had Harry said what he'd said to a sad old ancient wizard who'd fought hard and endured more than anyone should ever have to endure? Even if the old wizard was wrong, did he deserve to be hurt for it, after all that had happened to him? Why was there a part of him that seemed to get angry at the old wizard beyond reason, lashing out at him harder than Harry had ever hit anyone, without thought of moderation once the rage had been raised, only to quiet as soon as Harry left his presence? Is it because you know Dumbledore won't fight back, that no matter what you say to him, however unfair. He'll never use his own power against you. He'll never treat you the way you treat him. Is this the way you treat people when you know they won't hit back? James Potter's bullying genes manifesting at last. Harry closed his eyes. Like the sorting hat speaking inside his head, what is the real reason for your anger? What do you fear? A whirlwind of images seemed to flash through Harry's mind. Then the past Dumbledore weeping into his hands. The present form of the old wizard, standing tall and terrible. A vision of Hermione screaming in her chains, in the metal chair, as Harry abandoned her to the Dementors, and an imagination of a woman with long white hair, had she looked like her husband, falling amid the flames of her bedroom, as a wand was held upon her, and orange light reflected from half-moon glasses. Albus Dumbledore had seemed to think that Harry would be better at that sort of thing than him, and Harry knew that he probably would be. He knew the math, after all. But it was understood, somehow it was understood, that utilitarian ethicists didn't actually rob banks so they could give the money to the poor. The end result of throwing away all ethical constraint wouldn't actually be sunshine and roses and happiness for all. The prescription of consequentialism was to take the action that led to the best net consequences, not actions that had one positive consequence and wrecked everything else along the way. Expected utility maximizers were allowed to take common sense into account when they were calculating their expectations. Somehow Harry had understood that, even before anyone else had warned him he'd understood. Before he'd read about Vladimir Lenin or the history of the French Revolution, he'd known. It might have been his earliest science fiction books warning him about people with good intentions, or maybe Harry had just seen the logic for himself. Somehow he'd known from the very beginning that if he stepped outside his ethics whenever there was a reason, the end result wouldn't be good. A final image came to him then. Lily Potter standing in front of her baby's crib and measuring the intervals between outcomes. The final outcome if she stayed and tried to curse her enemy, dead Lily, dead Harry. The final outcome if she walked away, live Lily, dead Harry. Weighing the expected utilities and making the only sensible choice. She would have been Harry's mother if she had. But human beings can't live like that, the boy's lips whispered to the empty classroom. Human beings can't live like that. 83. Taboo Trade-Offs, Aftermath 1. When Padma entered the Transfiguration classroom, she saw that half the class had beaten her there, a strange, deathly silence pervading the room. Harry Potter sat alone in one corner, staring off into some unknown distance, his eyes half-lidded, nearly closed. Rumor said that the Aurors had discovered that the defense professor had polyjuiced as Granger to fool Malfoy. Rumor said that Hermione had been bound by the unbreakable vow to be Draco Malfoy's slave. Rumor said that Hermione had gotten the Dementor's kiss. But if that were true, Harry Potter wouldn't be sitting there. He would be Padma didn't know what General Potter would do. Her mind went blank, trying to think about it. Even when Professor McGonagall got there, the silence hadn't broken. The Transfiguration professor walked up to the board without a pause, erased it with a sweep of her hand, and then began to write. "Today, children," began the calm professional voice of the Transfiguration professor, just as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened that week. "We shall learn how much effort it takes to sustain a transfiguration, and why at your age you should not even try. The original form is not gone, only suppressed. And to maintain that suppression, excuse me," said Padma Patil. She knew her voice was shaking. She knew that she was trembling visibly, but she had to ask. "Excuse me, Professor, what happened with Miss Granger?" The Transfiguration professor paused at the board and turned to look at Padma. The professor should have looked stern, having been interrupted without a hand being raised, but instead her face was kindly. "You don't already know, Miss Patil. I expected that rumor would have spread." "There's too many rumors," said Padma. "I don't know what's true." Morag McDougal raised her hand, then said without waiting to be called, "I told you, Padma. What's true is that the Wisengamot found Granger guilty and ordered her to get the Dementor's kiss, and they brought in the Dementor, and Harry Potter glued it to the ceiling and wouldn't let it down until—" "Oh, dear Merlin," said Professor McGonagall, her expression growing sharp, but then she visibly calmed herself. "The affair was utterly ridiculous, and I shan't go into detail. Let it stand that Miss Granger is resting with Madame Pomfrey for now and coming back to classes tomorrow. and if I catch anyone bothering her, I shall turn them into glass vases and drop them." The entire class gasped at this. It wasn't so much that the threat was fatal as that it broke the safety rules for transfiguration. Professor McGonagall turned back to her board. From a corner of the classroom, another voice rose up. "What about Professor Quirrell?" said Terry Boot. "Has he been arrested?" "The auras are only detaining him," said the Transfiguration Professor without turning around. "If they have not given back our defense professor by tomorrow, I shall ask the headmaster to go fetch him. Though I may as well tell you now that the Board of Governors has scheduled a vote on whether Professor Quirrell's battles shall be allowed to continue." Kevin Entwistle spoke. "And General Malfoy, when's he getting back from St. Mungo's?" The Transfiguration Professor paused in her drawing. She turned around again, more slowly this time. "I am sorry, Mr. Entwistle," said Professor McGonagall. Her face looked a little more lined than when she had entered the room. "Mr. Malfoy's health is in no danger, I am given to understand. Unfortunately, I have received an owl from Mr. Malfoy's father withdrawing him from Hogwarts. I am afraid he is not coming back." 84. Taboo Trade-Offs, Aftermath 2. When Hermione Granger woke, she found herself lying in a soft, comfortable bed of the Hogwarts infirmary, with a square of setting sunlight falling on her midriff, warm through the thin blanket. Memory said that there would be a screen sheet above her, either drawn around her bed or open, and that the rest of Madame Pomfrey's domain would lie beyond. The other beds, occupied or unoccupied, and bright windows set in the curvily carven stone of Hogwarts. When Hermione opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was the face of Professor McGonagall, sitting on the left side of her bed. Professor Flitwick wasn't there, but that was understandable. He'd stayed by her side all morning in the detention cell, his silver raven standing extra guard against the Dementor, and his stern little face always turned outward toward the auras. The head of Ravenclaw had surely spent way too much time on her, and probably had to get back to teaching his classes, instead of keeping watch on a convicted attempted murderess. She felt horribly, horribly sick, and she didn't think it was because of any potions. Hermione would have started crying again, only her throat hurt, her eyes still burned, and her mind just felt tired. She couldn't have borne to weep again, couldn't find the strength for tears. "Where are my parents?" Hermione whispered to the head of House Gryffindor. Somehow it seemed like the worst thing in the world to face them, even worse than everything else, and yet she still wanted to see them. The gentle look on Professor McGonagall's face transfigured into something sadder. "I'm sorry, Miss Granger. Though it was not always so, we have found in recent years that it is wiser not to tell the parents of Muggleborns about any danger their child has faced. I should advise you also to remain silent if you wish to stay at Hogwarts without trouble from them." "I'm not being expelled," the girl whispered. "For what I did." "No," said Professor McGonagall. "Miss Granger, surely you heard. I hope you heard Mr. Potter when he said that you were innocent." "He was just saying that," she said dully. "To get me free, I mean." The older witch shook her head firmly. "No, Miss Granger. Mr. Potter believes you were memory charmed, that the whole duel never happened. The headmaster suspects even darker magics may have been involved, that your own hand might have cast the spell, but not your own will. Even Professor Snape finds the affair completely unbelievable, though he may not be able to say so publicly. He was wondering if Muggle drugs might have been used on you." Hermione's eyes went on staring distantly at the Transfiguration Professor. She knew that she'd just been told something significant, but she couldn't find the energy to propagate any changes through her mind. "Surely you don't believe it," said Professor McGonagall. "Miss Granger, you cannot believe of yourself that you would turn to murder." But her excellent memory, helpfully replayed it for the 1,000th time, Draco Malfoy telling her with a sneer that she'd never beat him when he wasn't tired, and then proceeding to prove just that, dancing like a duelist between the warded trophies while she frantically scrambled, and dealing the ending blow with a hex that sent her crashing against the wall and drew blood from her cheek. And then she'd— "But you remember doing it," said the older witch, who was watching over her with kindly understanding. "Miss Granger, there is no need for a 12-year-old girl to bear such dreadful memories. Say the word and I shall be happy to lock them away for you." It was like a glass of warm water thrown into her face. "What?" Professor McGonagall took out her wand. a gesture so practiced and quick that it seemed like pointing a finger. "I can't offer to rid you of the memories entirely, Miss Granger," the Transfiguration professor said with her customary precision. "There may be important facts buried there, but there is a form of the memory charm which is reversible, and I shall be happy to cast that on you." Hermione stared at the wand, feeling the stirrings of hope for the first time in almost 2 days. Make it didn't happen. She'd wished that over and over again, for the hands of time to turn back and erase the horrible choice that could never, ever be undone. And if erasing the memory wasn't that, it was still a kind of release. She looked back at Professor McGonagall's kindly face. "You really don't think I did it?" Hermione said, her voice trembling. "I am quite certain you would never do such a thing of your own will." Beneath her blankets, Hermione's hands clutched at the sheets. "Harry doesn't think I did it. Mr. Potter is of the opinion that your memories are entire fabrications. I can rather see his point." Then Hermione's clutching fingers let go of the sheet, and she slumped back into the bed, from which she'd partially risen. No, she hadn't said anything. She'd woken up and remembered what had happened last night, and it had been like. She couldn't find words even in her own thoughts for what it had been like. But she'd known that Draco Malfoy was already dead, and she hadn't said anything, hadn't gone to Professor Flitwick and confessed. She'd just dressed herself and gone down to breakfast and tried to act normal so that nobody would ever know. And she'd known it was wrong and horribly, horribly wrong, but she'd been so scared. Even if Harry Potter was right, even if the duel with Draco Malfoy was a lie, she'd made that choice all by herself. She didn't deserve to forget that, or be forgiven for it. And if she had done the right thing, gone straight to Professor Flitwick, maybe that would have helped, somehow. Maybe everyone would have seen then that she regretted it, and Harry wouldn't have had to give away all his money to save her. Hermione shut her eyes, squeezed them shut really tight. She couldn't bear to start crying again. "I'm a horrible person," she said in a wavering voice. "I'm awful. I'm not heroic at all." Professor McGonagall's voice was very sharp, like Hermione had just made some dreadful mistake on her Transfiguration homework. "Stop being foolish, Miss Granger. Horrible is whoever did this to you. And as for being heroic, well, Miss Granger, you have already heard my opinion about young girls trying to involve themselves in such things before they are even 14, so I shall not lecture you on it again. I shall say only that you have just had an absolutely dreadful experience, which you survived as well as any witch in your year possibly could. Today you are allowed to cry as much as you like. Tomorrow you're going back to class." That was when Hermione knew that Professor McGonagall couldn't help her. She needed someone to scold her. She couldn't be absolved if she couldn't be blamed, and Professor McGonagall would never do that for her, would never ask so much of a little Ravenclaw girl. It was something Harry Potter wouldn't help her with either. Hermione turned over in the infirmary bed, huddling into herself, away from Professor McGonagall. "Please," she whispered. "I want to talk to the headmaster, Hermione." When Hermione Granger opened her eyes a second time, she saw the care-lined face of Albus Dumbledore leaning over her bedside, looking almost as though he'd been crying, though that was impossible, and Hermione felt another stabbing pang of guilt for having bothered him so. "Minerva said you wished to speak with me," the old wizard said. Suddenly Hermione didn't know at all what to say. Her throat locked up, and all she could do was stammer. I'm. Somehow her tone must have communicated the other word, the one she couldn't even say anymore. "Sorry," said Dumbledore. "Why, for what should you be sorry?" She had to force the words out of her throat. "We're telling Harry that he shouldn't pay, so I shouldn't have done what Professor McGonagall said. I shouldn't have touched his wand." "My dear," said Dumbledore, "had you not pledged yourself to the House of Potter, Harry would have attacked Azkaban single-handedly, and quite possibly won. That boy may choose his words carefully, but I have never yet known him to lie. And in the boy who lived, there is power that the Dark Lord never knew. He would indeed have tried to break Azkaban, even at cost of his life." The old wizard's voice grew gentler and kinder. "No, Hermione, you have nothing at all for which to blame yourself. I could have made him not do it." In Dumbledore's eyes, a small twinkle appeared before it was lost to weariness. "Really, Miss Granger, perhaps you should be headmistress in my place, for I myself have no such power over stubborn children." Harry promised. Her voice stopped. The awful truth was very hard to speak. "Harry Potter promised me that he would never help me if I told him not to." There was a pause. The distant noises of the infirmary that had accompanied Professor McGonagall had ceased, Hermione realized, when Dumbledore had awoken her. From where she lay in bed, she could see only the ceiling and the top of one wall's windows, but nothing in her range of vision moved, and if there were sounds, she could not hear them. "Ah," said Dumbledore. The old wizard sighed heavily. Suppose it is possible that the boy would have kept his promise. I should have gone to Azkaban of your own will," Dumbledore said. "Miss Granger, that is more than I would ever ask anyone to take upon themselves." But Hermione swallowed. She couldn't help but notice the loophole. Anyone who wanted to get through the portrait door to the Ravenclaw dorm quickly learned to pay attention to exact wordings. "But it's not more than you take on yourself." "Hermione," the old wizard began. "Why?" said Hermione's voice. It seemed to be running on without her mind now. "Why couldn't I be braver? I was going to run in front of the Dementor, for Harry before, I mean, in January, so why couldn't I? Why had the thought of being sent to Azkaban just completely unglued her? Why had she forgotten everything about being good? My dear girl," Dumbledore said. The blue eyes behind the half-moon glasses showed a complete understanding of her guilt. "I would have done no better myself in my first year in Hogwarts. As you would be kind to others, be kinder to yourself as well. So I did do the wrong thing." Somehow she needed to say that to be told that, even though she already knew. There was a pause. "Listen, young Ravenclaw," the old wizard said. "Hear me well, for I shall speak to you a truth. Most ill-doers do not think of themselves as evil. Indeed, most conceive themselves the heroes of the stories they tell. I once thought that the greatest evil in this world was done in the name of the greater good. I was wrong, terribly wrong. There is evil in this world which knows itself for evil and hates the good with all its strength. All fair things does it desire to destroy." Hermione shivered in her bed. Somehow it seemed very real when Dumbledore said it. The old wizard continued speaking. "You are one of the fair things of this world, Hermione Granger, and so that evil hates you as well. If you had stayed firm through even this trial, it would have struck you harder and yet harder until you shattered. Do not think that heroes cannot be broken. We are only more difficult to break, Hermione." The old wizard's eyes had grown sterner than she had ever seen. "When you have been exhausted for many hours, when pain and death is not a passing fear but a certainty, then it is harder to be a hero. If I must speak the truth, then today, yes, I would not waver in the face of Azkaban. But when I was a first year in Hogwarts, I would have fled from the Dementor that you confronted, for my father had died in Azkaban, and I feared them. Know this, the evil that struck at you could have broken anyone, even myself. Only Harry Potter has it within him to face that horror when he has come fully into his power." Hermione's neck couldn't stare at the old wizard any longer. She let her head fall back to the pillow, where she stared up at the ceiling, absorbing what she could. "Why?" Her voice trembled again. "Why would anyone be that evil? I don't understand." "I, too, have wondered," said Dumbledore's voice, a deep sadness in it. "For thrice 10 years I wondered, and I still do not understand. You and I will never understand, Hermione Granger. But at least I know now what true evil would say for itself if we could speak to it and ask why it was evil. It would say, why not?" A brief flare of indignation inside her. "There's got to be a million reasons why not." "Indeed," said Dumbledore's voice. "A million reasons and more. We will always know those reasons, you and I, if you insist on putting it that way. Then yes, Hermione, this day's trial broke you. But what happens after you break that, too, is part of being a hero, which you are, Hermione Granger, and will always be." She raised her head again, staring at him. The old wizard got up from beside her bed. His silver beard dipped down as Dumbledore bowed to her gravely and left. She went on looking at where the old wizard had gone. It should have meant something to her, should have touched her, should have made her felt better inside, that Dumbledore, who had seemed so reluctant before, had now acknowledged her as a hero. She felt nothing. Hermione let her head fall back to the bed as Madame Pomfrey came and made her drink something that seared her lips like the afterburn of spicy food and smelled even hotter and didn't taste like anything at all. It meant nothing to her. She went on staring up at the distant stone tiles of the ceiling. Minerva was waiting, doing her best not to hover, beside the double doors to the Hogwarts infirmary. She'd always thought of those doors as the ominous gates, as a child in Hogwarts, and couldn't help but remember that now. Too much bad news had been spoken here. Albus stepped out. The old wizard did not pause on the way out of the infirmary. only kept walking toward Professor Flitwick's office, and Minerva followed him. Professor McGonagall cleared her throat. "Is it done, Albus?" The old wizard nodded in affirmation. "If any hostile magic is cast on her, or any spirit touches her, I shall know and come." "I spoke to Mr. Potter after Transfiguration class," said Professor McGonagall. "He was of the opinion that Miss Granger should go to Beauxbatons rather than Hogwarts from now on." The old wizard shook his head. "No. If Voldemort truly desires to strike at Miss Granger, he is tenacious beyond measure. His servants are returning to him. He could not have retrieved Bellatrix alone. Azkaban itself is not safe from his malice. And as for Beauxbatons, no, Minerva. I do not think Voldemort can essay such possessions often or against stronger targets, or this year would have gone quite differently. And Harry Potter is here, whom Voldemort must fear whether he admits it or no. Now that I have warded her, Miss Granger will be safer within Hogwarts than without." "Mr. Potter seemed to doubt that," Minerva said. She couldn't quite keep the edge from her voice. There was a part of her that agreed rather strongly. He seemed to feel that common sense said Miss Granger should continue her education anywhere but Hogwarts. The old wizard sighed. "I fear the boy has spent too much time among the Muggles. Always they reach for safety. Always they imagine that safety can be reached. If Miss Granger is not safe within the center of our fortress, she shall be no safer for leaving it." "Not everyone seems to think so," said Professor McGonagall. It had been almost the first letter she'd seen when she'd taken a quick look at her desk. An envelope of the finest sheepskin, sealed in greenish-silver wax, pressed into the image of a snake that rose and hissed at her. "I have received Lord Malfoy's owl withdrawing his son from Hogwarts." The old wizard nodded, but did not break stride. "Does Harry know?" "Yes." Her voice faltered for a moment, remembering Harry's expression. After class, Mr. Potter complimented Lord Malfoy's excellent good sense and said that he would be writing Madame Longbottom advising her to do the same with her grandson in case he was the next target. In the event that Mr. Longbottom's guardian was so negligent as to keep him in Hogwarts, Mr. Potter wanted him to have a time-turner, an invisibility cloak, a broomstick, and a pouch in which to carry them. Also a tow ring with an emergency portkey to a safe location, in case someone kidnaps Mr. Longbottom and takes him outside Hogwarts's wards. I told Mr. Potter that I did not think the ministry would consent to such use of our time-turners, and he said that we should not ask. I expect he will want Miss Granger to receive the same if she stays. And for himself, Mr. Potter wants a 3-person broomstick to carry in his pouch. She wasn't awed by the list of precautions, impressed with the cleverness, but not awed. She was a transfiguration mistress, after all. But it still sent shivers of disquiet through her that Harry Potter now thought Hogwarts as dangerous as spell research. "The Department of Mysteries is not lightly defied," said Albus. But for the rest, the old wizard seemed to slump in on himself slightly. "We may as well give the boy what he wishes, and I will ward Neville also, and write Augusta to say that he should stay here over holiday. And finally," she said, "Mr. Potter says, this is a direct quote, Albus, whatever kind of dark wizard attractant the headmaster is keeping here, he needs to get it out of this school now." She couldn't stop the edge in her own voice that time. "I asked as much of Flamel," Albus said, the pain clear in his voice. "But Master Flamel has said that even he can no longer keep safe the stone, that he believes Voldemort has means of finding it wherever it is hidden, and that he does not consent for it to be guarded anywhere but Hogwarts. Minerva, I am sorry, but it must be done, must." "Very well," said Professor McGonagall. "But for myself, I think that Mr. Potter is right on every single count." The old wizard glanced at her, and his voice caught as he said, "Minerva, you have known me long, and as well as any soul still living, tell me, have I lost myself to darkness already?" "What?" said Professor McGonagall in genuine surprise. Then, "Oh, Albus, no." The old wizard's lips pressed together tightly before he spoke. "For the greater good. I have sacrificed so many for the greater good. Today I almost condemned Hermione Granger to Azkaban for the greater good. And I found myself beginning to resent the innocence that is no longer mine." The old wizard's voice halted. "Evil done in the name of good, evil done in the name of evil. Which is worse? You are being silly, Albus." The old wizard glanced at her again before turning his eyes back to their way. "Tell me, Minerva, did you pause to weigh the consequences, before you told Miss Granger how to bind herself to the Potter family. She took an involuntary breath as she understood what she had done, so you did not. Albus's eyes were saddened. No, Minerva, you must not apologize. It is well. For what you have seen of me this day, if your first loyalty is now to Harry Potter, and not to me, then that is right and proper. She opened her lips to protest, but Albus went on before she could say a word. Indeed, indeed, that will be necessary, and more than necessary, if the Dark Lord that Harry must defeat to come into his power is not Voldemort after all. Not this again, Minerva said. Albus, it was you know, who not you, who marked Harry as his equal. There is no possible way that the prophecy could be talking about you. The old wizard nodded, but his eyes still seemed distant, fixed only on the road ahead. The holding cell, well to the center of magical law enforcement, was luxuriously appointed, more a remark on what adult wizards took for granted than any special feeling toward prisoners. There was a self-reclining, self-rocking chair with plush, richly textured, self-warming cushions. There was a bookcase containing random books rescued from a bargain bin and a full shelf of ancient magazines, including one from 1883. As for toiletries, well, it wasn't exactly luxurious, but there was a spell on the room which put all that business on hold. You weren't to go anywhere that the watching aura couldn't see you. But aside from that, it was quite a pleasant little cell. The defense professor of Hogwarts was being detained, not arrested, not even intimidated. There was no evidence to indict him, except that a terrible and unusual crime had been committed at the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and going by previous occasions, the odds were 5-1 that the current defense professor was tangled up in it somehow. To this must be added the fact that nobody in the DML even knew who the defense professor was, and that the man had literally sneezed at all attempts to uncover his true identity. Why, no, they hadn't released Quirinus Quirrell back to Hogwarts just yet. Let us repeat this for emphasis. The defense professor was being detained in a cell. The defense professor was staring at the watching aura and humming. The defense professor has not spoken a single word since he arrived in this particular cell. He has only been humming. The humming started as a simple children's lullaby, the one that in Muggle Britain begins, lullaby and good night. This tune was hummed, without variation, over and over, for 7 minutes to establish the underlying pattern. Then began the elaborations upon the theme. Phrases hummed too slow, with long pauses in between, so that the listener's mind helplessly waits and waits for the next note, the next phrase. And then, when that next phrase comes, it is so out of key, so unbelievably awfully out of key, not just out of key for the previous phrases, but sung at a pitch which does not correspond to any key, that you would have to believe this person had spent hours deliberately practicing their humming just to acquire such perfect anti-pitch. It bears the same semblance to music as the awful dead voice of a dementor bears to human speech, and this horrible, horrible humming is impossible to ignore. It is similar to a known lullaby, but it departs from that pattern unpredictably. It sets up expectations and then violates them, never in any constant pattern that would permit the humming to fade into the background. The listener's brain cannot prevent itself from expecting the anti-musical phrases to complete, nor prevent itself from noticing the surprises. The only possible explanation for how this mode of humming came to exist is that it was deliberately designed by some unspeakably cruel genius who woke up one day, feeling bored with ordinary torture, who decided to handicap himself and find out whether he could break someone's sanity just by humming at them. The aura has been listening to this unimaginably dreadful humming for 4 hours, while being stared at by a huge, cold, lethal presence that feels equally horrible whether he looks at it directly or lets it hover at the corner of his vision. The humming stopped. There was a long wait, time enough for false hope to rise and be squashed down by the memory of previous disappointments. And then, as the interval lengthened and lengthened, that hope rose again unstoppably. The humming began once more. The aura cracked. From his belt, the aura took a mirror, tapped it once, and then said, "This is Junior Aura Argent Alterne. I'm calling in code RJL20 on cell 3. Code RJL20, the mirror said in surprised tones. There was a sound of pages being flipped then. You want to be relieved because a prisoner is attempting psychological warfare and succeeding. Amelia Bones really is quite intelligent. What the prisoner say to you? Said the mirror. This question is not part of procedure RJL 20, but unfortunately, Amelia Bones has failed to include an explicit instruction that the commanding officer should not ask. He's, said the aura, and glanced back at the cell. The defense professor was now leaning back in his chair, looking quite relaxed. He was staring at me, and humming. There was a pause. The mirror spoke again. And you're calling in an RJL 20 over that. You're sure you're not just trying to get out of watching him? Amelia Bones is surrounded by idiots. You don't understand, yelled Aura Alternate. It's really awful humming. The mirror transmitted a sound of muffled laughter in the background, sounding like it was coming from more than one person. Then speech again. Mr. Alternate, if you don't want to be busted to Junior Aura second class, I suggest you buckle down and get back to work. Strike that, a crisp voice said, sounding slightly remote due to its distance from the mirror. Which is why Amelia Bones often sits in on a coordination center of the DMLE while doing her ministry-required paperwork. Aura Alternate, said the crisp voice, seeming to approach closer to the mirror. You will be relieved shortly. Aura Ben Gutierrez, the procedure for RJL 20 does not say that you ask why. It says that you relieve the aura who calls it in. If I find that auras seem to be abusing it, I will modify the procedure to prevent its abuse. The mirror cut off abruptly. The aura turned back to look triumphantly where the current defense professor of Hogwarts was leaning back in his cushioned chair. That man then spoke the first words that had left his lips since he entered the cell. Goodbye, Mr. Alternate, said the defense professor. A few minutes later, the door to the detention cell opened, and in walked a grey-haired woman, dressed in the crimson-tinged robes of an aura without any sign of rank or other ornamentation, carrying a black leather folder under her left arm. You're relieved, the old woman said abruptly. There was a brief delay while Aura Alternate tried to explain what had been happening. This was cut short by a nod and a stark, simple finger pointing out the door. Good evening, Madam Director, said the defense professor. Amelia Bones did not acknowledge this statement, but sat down abruptly in the vacated chair. The old witch opened the black folder, and her gaze moved down to the parchments therein. Possible hints to the identity of the current Hogwarts defense professor, as compiled by Aura Robards. The title parchment was turned, flipped aside. The defense professor said that he was sorted into Slytherin, claimed that his family was killed by Voldemort. Said he had studied at a martial arts center in Muggle Asia, which was destroyed by Voldemort. A request filed with the Department of International Magical Cooperation identifies this incident as the only affair of 1969. Another parchment was flipped aside. It also seems this defense professor gave a most stirring speech to his students just before last Yule, castigating the previous generation for their disunity against the Death Eaters. The old witch looked up from the leather folder. Madame Longbottom was rather taken with it and insisted that I read the entire thing. The argument struck me as familiar, though I could not place it at the time. But then, of course, I had thought you dead. The chief law enforcement officer of Magical Britain was now gazing sharply at the current defense professor of Hogwarts, across the pane of spell-reinforced glass separating them. The man in the cell returned the gaze equably, without apparent alarm. I shall not name any names, said the old witch, but I shall tell a story and see if it sounds familiar. Amelia Bones looked back down, turning to the next parchment. Born 1927, entered Hogwarts in 1938, sorted into Slytherin, graduated 1945. Went on a graduation tour abroad and disappeared while visiting Albania, presumed dead, until 1970, when he returned to magical Britain just as suddenly, without any explanation for the missing 25 years. He remained estranged from his family and friends, living in isolation. In 1971, while visiting Diagon Alley, he fended off an attempt by Bellatrix Black to kidnap the daughter of the Minister of Magic and used the killing curse to slay 2 of the 3 Death Eaters accompanying her. Beyond this, all Britain knows the story. Need I continue it? The old witch looked up from her folder again. Very well. There was a trial in the Wisengamot, during which this young man was exonerated for his use of the killing curse, not least due to the efforts of his grandmother, the lady of his house. He was reconciled with his family, and they held a house gathering to welcome his return. The guest of honor arrived at that gathering to find his entire family slain by Death Eaters, even to the house elves, and that he himself, of cadet line, was now the last remaining scion of a most ancient house. The defense professor had not reacted at all to any of this, except that his eyes had half closed, as though in weariness. The young man took up his family seat in the Wisengamot, becoming among the most steadfast voices against you-know-who. Several times he led forces against the Death Eaters, fighting with skillful tactics and extraordinary power. People began to speak of him as the next Dumbledore. It was thought that he might become Minister of Magic after the Dark Lord fell. On the 3rd of July, 1973, he failed to appear at a key Wisengamot vote and was never heard from again. We assumed you-know-who had killed him. It was a grave blow to all of us, and matters went much the worse from that day on. The old witch's gaze was questioning. I mourned you myself. What happened? The defense professor's shoulders moved lightly, a small shrug. You make many assumptions, the defense professor said softly. For myself, I would believe that man died years ago. But if that man is nonetheless alive, then it is clear he does not wish the fact announced and has reasons enough for silence. That man was once of some help to you, it seems. The defense professor's lips curved in a cynical smile. But I am no longer surprised when gratitude is fleeting. Is there yet more that you would demand from him? The old witch leaned back in her aura's monitoring chair, looking rather startled, maybe even hurt. No, she said after a moment. Her fingers tapped the leather folder. Nervously, you might have thought, if you had believed that Amelia Bones could ever be nervous. But your house, there are not many ancient houses remaining. It shall matter little to this country whether 8 ancient houses remain or 7. The old witch sighed. What does Dumbledore think of this? The man in the detention cell shook his head. He does not know who I am, and promised not to inquire. The old witch's eyebrows rose. How did he identify you to the Hogwarts wards then? A slight smile. The headmaster drew a circle and told Hogwarts that he who stood within was the defense professor. Speaking of which, the tone went lower, flatter. I am missing my classes, Director Bones. You seem to rest, sometimes, in a peculiar manner. This has also been reported, and you seem to be resting more and more frequently as time goes on. The old witch's fingers tapped the leather folder again. I cannot recall reading of such a symptom, but when one hears of such a thing, one imagines. Dark wizards fought and terrible curses received. The defense professor remained expressionless. Do you require a healer's help? Said Amelia Bones. Her own mask had slipped, clearly showing the pain in her eyes. Is there anything at all that can be done for you? I agreed to teach defense at Hogwarts, the man in the cell said flatly. Draw your own conclusions, madam. And I am missing my classes, of which there are not many left. I would return to Hogwarts now. When Hermione woke the 3rd time, though it felt like she'd only closed her eyes for a moment, the sun was even lower in the sky, almost fully set. She felt a little more alive, and strangely, even more exhausted. This time it was Professor Flitwick who was standing next to her bed and shaking her shoulder, a tray of steaming food floating next to him. For some reason she thought Harry Potter ought to be leaning over her bedside, but he wasn't there. Had she dreamed that? She couldn't remember dreaming. It developed, according to Professor Flitwick, that Hermione had missed dinner in the Great Hall and was being woken to eat. And then she could go back to the Ravenclaw dorm and her own bed to sleep the rest of the night. She ate in silence. There was a part of her that wanted to ask Professor Flitwick whether he thought she'd been memory charmed or she'd tried to kill Draco Malfoy of her own will, like she remembered doing. But most of her was afraid to find out. Afraid to find out was a warning sign, according to Harry Potter and his books. But her mind felt tired, bruised, and she couldn't muster the strength to override it. When she and Professor Flitwick left the infirmary, they found Harry Potter sitting, cross-legged outside the door, quietly reading a psychology textbook. I'll take her from here, said the boy who lived. Professor McGonagall said it would be all right. Professor Flitwick seemed to accept this, and departed after a stern look at both of them. She couldn't imagine what the stern look was supposed to say, unless it was don't try to kill any more students. The footsteps of Professor Flitwick faded, and the two of them stood alone outside the doors of the infirmary. She looked at the green eyes of the boy who lived, the mess of hair that didn't quite obscure the scar on his forehead. She looked upon the face of the boy who'd given all his money to save her without a second thought. There were feelings inside her: guilt, shame, embarrassment, other things as well, but no words. There was nothing she knew how to say. "So," Harry said abruptly, "I did a quick skim through my psychology books to see what they said about post-traumatic stress disorder. The old book said you should talk about the experience immediately afterward with a counselor. The newer research says that when they actually ran experiments, it turned out that talking about it immediately afterward made it worse. Apparently, what you really ought to do is run with your mind's natural impulse to repress the memories and just not think about it for a while." It was so normal for the way she and Harry usually talked that she felt a sudden burning in her throat. "We don't have to talk about it." That was what Harry had just said, more or less. It felt like cheating, maybe even like a lie. Nothing was normal. Everything wrong was still horribly wrong. Everything left unsaid still needed to be said. "Okay," said Hermione, because there wasn't anything else to say, anything else at all. "I'm sorry I wasn't waiting when you woke up," Harry said as they started to walk. "Madame Pomfrey wouldn't let me in, so I just stayed out here." He gave a small, sad-looking shrug. "I suppose I should be out there trying to run damage control on public relations, but honestly, I've never been good at that. I just end up speaking sharply at people." "How bad is it?" She thought her voice should have come out in a whisper, a croak, but it didn't. "Well," Harry said with obvious hesitation, "the thing you've got to understand, Hermione, is that you had a lot of defenders at breakfast time today, but everyone on your side was making stuff up. Draco tried to kill you first, things like that. It was Granger versus Malfoy. That's how people saw it, like a seesaw where pushing his side down meant pushing your side up. I told them you were probably both innocent, that you'd both been memory charmed. They didn't listen. Both sides treated me like a traitor trying to play the middle. And then people heard that Draco had testified under Veritasrum that he'd been trying to help you before the battle stopped, making that expression, Hermione. You didn't actually do anything to him. Anyway, all people understood was that the pro-Malfoy faction had been right and the pro-Granger faction had been wrong." Harry gave a small sigh. "I told them that when the truth came out later, they'd be embarrassed." "How bad is it?" she said again. This time her voice did come out weaker. "Remember Ash's conformity experiment?" Harry said, turning his head to give her a serious look. Her mind was slow to remember for a few seconds, which frightened her, but then the reference came back. In 1951, Solomon Ash had taken some experimental subjects, and each one had been put among a row of other people who looked like them, seeming like other experimental subjects, but actually confederates of the experimenter. They'd shown a reference line on a screen, labeled X, next to three other lines, labeled A, B, and C. The experimenter had asked which line X was the same length as. The correct answer had obviously been C. The other subjects, the Confederates, had one after another said that X was the same length as B. The real subject had been put second to last in the order, so as not to arouse suspicion by being last. The test had been to see whether the real subject would conform to the standard wrong answer of B, or voice the obviously correct answer of C. 75% of the subjects had conformed, at least once. A third of the subjects had conformed more than half the time. Some had reported afterward, actually believing that X was the same length as B, and that had been in a case where the subjects hadn't known any of the Confederates. If you put people around others who belonged to the same group as them, like someone in a wheelchair next to other people in a wheelchair, the conformity effect got even stronger. Hermione had a sickening feeling where this was going. "I remember," she whispered. "I gave the Chaos Legion anti-conformity training, you know. I had each legionnaire stand in the middle and say, 'Twice 2 is 4, or grass is green.' Everyone else in the Chaos Legion called them idiots or sneered at them. Alan Flint did really good sneers, or even just gave them blank looks and then walked away. The thing you've got to remember is only the Chaos Legion has ever practiced anything like that. Nobody else in Hogwarts even knows what conformity is." "Harry," her voice was wobbling. "How bad is it?" Harry gave another sad-looking shrug. "Everyone in the second year and above, since they don't know you. Everyone in Dragon Army. All of Slytherin, of course. And well, most of the rest of magical Britain too, I think. Remember, Lucius Malfoy controls the Daily Prophet. Everyone," she whispered. Her limbs had started to feel cold, like she'd just gotten out of an unheated swimming pool. What people really believe doesn't feel like a belief. It feels like the way the world is. You and I are standing in a private little bubble of the universe where Hermione Granger got memory charmed. Everyone else is living in the world where Hermione Granger tried to murder Draco Malfoy. If Ernie Macmillan, her breath caught in her throat. Captain Macmillan thinks he's ethically prohibited from being your friend now. Well, he's trying to do the right thing as he understands it, in the world he thinks he lives in. Harry's eyes were very serious. Hermione, you've told me a lot of times that I look down too much on other people. But if I expected too much of them, if I expected people to get things right, I really would hate them then. Idealism aside, Hogwarts students don't actually know enough cognitive science to take responsibility for how their own minds work. It's not their fault they're crazy. Harry's voice was strangely gentle, almost like an adult's. I know it's going to be harder on you than it would be on me. But remember, eventually, the real culprit gets nailed. The truth comes out, everyone who was confidently wrong gets embarrassed. And if the real culprit doesn't get caught, she said in a trembling voice, or if it turns out to be me after all, then you can leave Hogwarts and go to the Salem Witches Institute in America. Leave Hogwarts. She'd never even thought of that possibility except as an ultimate punishment. Hermione, I think you might want to do that anyway. Hogwarts isn't a castle, it's insanity with walls. You've got other options. She stammered. I'll have to think about it. Harry nodded. At least nobody's going to try hexing you, not after what the headmaster said at dinner tonight. Oh, and Ron Weasley came up to me looking very serious and told me that if I saw you first, I should tell you that he's sorry for having thought badly of you and he'll never speak ill of you again. Ron believes I'm innocent, said Hermione. Well, he doesn't think you're innocent, per se. The whole Ravenclaw dorm went silent as the two of them walked in, staring at them, staring at her. She'd had nightmares like this. And then, one by one, people looked away from her. Penelope Clearwater, the fifth-year prefect in charge of first years, looked away slowly and deliberately, turning her head to face in another direction. Sue Lee and Lisa Turpin and Michael Corner, all sitting at a table together, all of whom she'd helped with their homework at one time or another, all looked away, their faces suddenly nervous, the moment she tried to catch their eyes. A third-year witch named Letitia Randall, whom SPHEW had twice saved from Slytherin bullies, quickly bent back over her desk and started doing homework again. Mandy Brocklehurst looked away from her. If Hermione didn't burst into tears, then it was only because she'd expected it, had played it out in her mind over and over again. At least people weren't screaming at her, or shoving her, or hexing her. They were just looking away. Hermione walked very straight up to the staircase that led toward the first-year girls' dorms. She didn't see Padma Patil or Anthony Goldstein looking at her, those two lone heads turning to track her as she left. From behind her, she heard Harry Potter saying in a very calm tone, "Now eventually the truth's going to come out, you all. So if you're all that confident she's guilty, can I ask you all to sign this paper right here, saying that if she later turns out to be innocent, she gets to say, 'I told you so,' and then hold it over you for the rest of your lives. Step on up, one and all, don't be cowards. If you really believe, you shouldn't be afraid to bet." She was halfway up the stairs when she realized that there would be other girls inside her dorm room, too. The stars hadn't quite come out yet, only one or two of the brightest ones visible through the reddish-purple haze of the horizon, though the sun had fully sunk. Hermione's hands dug into the harsh stone of the parapet guarding the small balcony, where she ducked out of the stairwell after realizing that she couldn't just go back to bed. The words echoed in her mind like, "You can't go home again," ought to sound. She stared out at the empty grounds, the fading sunset, the sprouting grass so far below. Tired, she was tired. She couldn't think now. She needed to sleep. Professor Flitwick had told her that she needed to sleep, and there'd been yet another potion with her dinner. Maybe that was how Wizarding Society treated horrible traumas to innocent young girls, just made them sleep a lot afterward. She should go to her room and sleep, but she was afraid to go someplace where other people were, afraid of how they might look at her or look away. Fragments of thought chased themselves around a mind too exhausted to finish or connect them as the night fully set in. Why did all this happen? Everything was fine a week ago. Why? From behind her came the creaky sound of an opening door. She turned her head and looked. Professor Quirrell was leaning against the doorway she'd walked through, silhouetted like a cardboard cutout by the light of the Hogwarts torches lit behind him in the open door. She couldn't see his expression, though the doorway behind him was bright. His eyes, his face, everything she could see from here lay within night's shadow. The defense professor of Hogwarts, #1 on the list of people who might have done this. She hadn't even realized she had a suspect list until that moment. The man stood within that doorway, saying nothing, and she couldn't see his eyes. What was he even doing there in the first place? "Are you here to kill me?" said Hermione Granger. Professor Quirrell's head tilted at that. Then the defense professor started toward her, the dark silhouette raising one hand slowly and deliberately, as though to push her off the Ravenclaw tower, stupefy. The burst of adrenaline overrode everything. She drew her wand without thinking. Her lips formed the word of their own accord. The stunbolt leapt out of her wand and slowed to a stop in front of Professor Quirrell's raised hand, rippling in midair like it was still trying to fly and making a slight hissing sound. The red glow illuminated Professor Quirrell's face for the first time, showing a strange, fond smile. "Better," said Professor Quirrell. "Miss Granger, you are still a student in my defense class. As such, if you consider me a threat, I do not expect you to just look at me sadly and ask if I am there to kill you. -2 Quirrell points." She was entirely unable to form words. The defense professor flicked his forefinger casually at the suspended stunbolt, sending the hex shooting back over her head, far into the night, so that they stood again in darkness. Then Professor Quirrell walked out of the doorway, which swung shut behind him, and a soft white light sprung up around the two of them so that she could see his face once more, still with that strange, fond smile. What are you doing here?" A few more steps took Professor Quirrell to a higher part of the balcony's ramparts, where he put his elbows down on the stone and leaned over heavily, looking up into the night. "I came here straight upon being released by the auras, the moment I finished reporting to the headmaster," said Professor Quirrell in a quiet voice, "because I am your teacher, and you are my student, and I am responsible for you." Hermione understood then, remembering what Professor Quirrell had said to Harry in the second defense lesson of the year about controlling his anger. She felt the flush of shame all the way down her chest. It took a moment after that for knowledge to override mortification, for her to force out the words, "I," said Hermione. "Harry thinks that I didn't lose my temper, I mean." "So I heard," said Professor Quirrell in rather dry tones. He shook his head, as though at the stars themselves. "The boy is fortunate that I have crossed the line from annoyance with his self-destructiveness into sheer curiosity as to what he shall do next. But I agree with Mr. Potter's assessment of the facts. This murder was well planned to evade detection both by the wards of Hogwarts and the headmaster's timely eye. Naturally, in such a thoughtful murder, some innocent would be placed to take the blame." A brief, wry smile crossed the defense professor's lips, though he wasn't looking at her. "As for the notion that you did it yourself, I consider myself a talented teacher, but even I could not teach such murderous intent to a student as obstinate and untalented as Hermione Granger." The part of her brain that said what? In indignation wasn't anywhere near loud enough to reach her lips. "No," said Professor Quirrell. "That is not why I am here. You have made no effort to hide your dislike for me, Miss Granger. I thank you for that lack of pretense, for I much prefer true hate to false love. But you are still my student, and I have a word to say to you if you will hear it." Hermione looked at him, still fighting down the after-effects of the adrenaline from before. The defense professor seemed to be just staring up at the dark sky in which the stars were becoming visible. "I was going to be a hero once," said Professor Quirrell, still looking upward. "Can you believe that, Miss Granger?" "No." "Thank you again, Miss Granger. It is true nonetheless. Long ago, long before your time or Harry Potter's, there was a man who was hailed as a savior, the destined scion, such a one as anyone would recognize from tales, wielding justice and vengeance like twin wands against his dreadful nemesis." Professor Quirrell gave a soft, bitter laugh, looking up at the night sky. "Do you know, Miss Granger, at that time I thought myself already cynical, and yet, well." The silence stretched, in the cold and the night. "In all honesty," said Professor Quirrell, looking up at the stars, "I still don't understand it. They should have known that their lives depended on that man's success. And yet it was as if they tried to do everything they could to make his life unpleasant. to throw every possible obstacle into his way. I was not naive, Miss Granger. I did not expect the power holders to align themselves with me so quickly, not without something in it for themselves. But their power, too, was threatened, and so I was shocked how they seemed content to step back and leave to that man all burdens of responsibility. They sneered at his performance, remarking among themselves how they would do better in his place, though they did not condescend to step forward. Professor Quirrell shook his head as though in bemusement. And it was the strangest thing, the dark wizard, that man's dread nemesis. Why, those who served him leapt eagerly to their tasks. The dark wizard grew crueler toward his followers, and they followed him all the more. Men fought for the chance to serve him, even as those whose lives depended on that other man made free to render his life difficult. I could not understand it, Miss Granger. Professor Quirrell's face was in shadow as he looked upward. Perhaps, by taking on himself the curse of action, that man removed it from all others. Was that why they felt free to hinder his battle against the dark wizard who would have enslaved them all? Believing men would act in their own interest was not cynicism, it turned out, but sheerest optimism. In reality, men do not meet so high a standard. And so in time that one realized he might do better fighting the dark wizard alone than with such followers at his back. So, Hermione's voice sounded strange in the night. You left your friends behind where they'd be safe and tried to attack the dark wizard all by yourself. Why, no, said Professor Quirrell. I stopped trying to be a hero and went off to do something else I found more pleasant. What? Said Hermione without thinking at all. That's horrible. The defense professor turned his head down from the sky to regard her, and she saw, in the light of the doorway, that he was smiling, or at least half his face was smiling. You're going to tell me, Miss Granger, that I am an awful person. Well, perhaps I am. But then are people who never even try to be heroes still worse? If I had never done anything at all like them, would you have thought better of me? Hermione opened her mouth and then found that, once again, she didn't have anything to say. It wasn't right to walk away from being a hero. You couldn't just do that. But she didn't want to say that everyone who wasn't a hero was nothing. That was Quirrell thinking. The smile, or half-smile, had disappeared. You were foolish, the defense professor said quietly, to expect any lasting gratitude from those you tried to protect once you named yourself a heroine, just as you expected that man to go on being a hero and called him horrible for stopping when 1,000 others never lifted a finger. It was only expected that you should fight bullies. It was a tax you owed, and they accepted it like princes, with a sneer for the lateness of your payment. And you have already witnessed, I wager, that their fondness vanished like dust in the wind once it was no longer in their interest to associate with you. The defense professor slowly straightened off the balcony, standing almost straight, turning to regard her fully. But you don't have to be a hero, Miss Granger, said Professor Quirrell. You can stop any time you please. That idea had occurred to her before, several times over the last 2 days. People become who they are meant to be by doing what is right, Headmaster Dumbledore had told her. The trouble was that there seemed to be two different right things to do. There was the part of her which said that right was to go on being a heroine and stay at Hogwarts. She didn't know what was going on, but a heroine wouldn't just run away. And there was also the voice of common sense saying that young children shouldn't ever stay around danger. That was what adults were for. The voice of every school poster that said not to take candy from strangers. That was also right. Hermione Granger stood there on that balcony, looking at Professor Quirrell silhouetted by the emerging stars, and she didn't understand. She didn't understand how the defense professor could be gazing at her with his face showing concern. She didn't understand the notes of pain in the defense professor's voice that caught at her. She didn't understand why she was being told all this. You don't even like me, Professor, said Hermione. A small smile flickered on Professor Quirrell's face. I suppose I could go on about how I am angered that this affair has taken up my valuable time and disrupted my defense classes. But mostly, Miss Granger, you are my student, and whatever other professions I may have once held, I think I have been a good teacher at Hogwarts, have I not? Suddenly, Professor Quirrell's eyes seemed very tired. As your teacher, then, I am advising you that you have other career options. I should not like to see anyone else going down my path. Hermione swallowed. Was a side of Professor Quirrell she'd never seen or imagined, and it was eating away at her preconceptions. Professor Quirrell watched her for a moment, and then looked away from her again, back up at the stars. When he spoke this time, his voice was quieter. "Someone here is targeting you, Miss Granger, and I cannot ward you as I warded Mr. Malfoy. The headmaster has prevented it, for what he claims to be good reasons. It is easy to become fond of Hogwarts, I know, for I am fond of it as well. But in France they take a different view of the ancient houses than in Britain, and Beauxbatons would not mistreat you, I think. Whatever else you imagine of me, I swear that if you ask me to see you safely in Beauxbatons, I would do all in my power to convey you there." "I can't just," Hermione said. "But you can, Miss Granger." Now the pale blue eyes watched her intently. "Whatever you wish to make of your life, you cannot attain it at Hogwarts, not anymore. This place is ruined for you now, even leaving aside all other threats. Simply ask Harry Potter to command you to go to Beauxbatons and live out your life in peace. If you stay here, he is your master in the eyes of Britain and its laws." She hadn't even been thinking about that. It paled so much in comparison to being eaten by Dementors. It had been important to her before, but now it all seemed childish, unimportant, pointless. So why were her eyes burning? "And if that fails to move you, Miss Granger, consider also that Mr. Potter has, just today at lunchtime, threatened Lucius Malfoy, Albus Dumbledore, and the entire Wisengamot, because he cannot think sensibly when something threatens to take you from him. Are you not frightened of what he will do next?" It made sense. Terrible sense. Dreadful, awful sense. Made too much sense. She couldn't have described it in words. What triggered the realization, unless it was the sheer pressure that the defense professor was exerting on her. That if the defense professor was behind this whole thing, then Professor Quirrell had done it all just to get her out of the way of his plans for Harry. Without any conscious decision, she shifted her weight to the other foot, her body moving away from the defense professor. "So you think I am the one responsible?" said Professor Quirrell. His voice sounded a little sad as he said it, and her own heart almost stopped from hearing it. "I suppose I cannot blame you. I am the defense professor of Hogwarts, after all. But Miss Granger, even assuming that I am your enemy, common sense should still tell you to get away from me very quickly. You cannot use the killing curse, so the correct tactic is to apparate away. I do not mind being the villain of your imagination if it makes matters clearer. Leave Hogwarts and leave me to those who can handle me. I will arrange for the transportation to be through some family of good repute, and Mr. Potter will know to blame me if you do not arrive safely." She was feeling cold, the night air chilling her skin, or maybe being chilled by it. "I've got to think about it." Professor Quirrell shook his head. "No, Miss Granger. Your departure will take time for me to arrange, and I have less time left than you may think. This decision may be painful for you, but it should not be ambiguous. Much weighs in the balance of these scales, but not evenly. I must know tonight whether you intend to go. And if not, was the defense professor warning her deliberately that if she didn't run, he would strike again? Why would it matter so much? What did Professor Quirrell want to do with Harry? Hermione Granger, I shall be less subtle than is usual for a mysterious old wizard, and tell you outright that you cannot imagine how badly things could go if the events surrounding Harry Potter turned to ill. The most powerful wizard in the world had told her that, when he was talking about how important it was that she not stop being Harry's friend. Hermione swallowed. She swayed a little where she stood, on the stone balcony of a magical castle. Suddenly, the whole deadly absurdity of the situation seemed to rise up and grab her by the throat, that 12-year-old girls shouldn't be in danger, shouldn't be thinking about such things, that Mum would want her to run away, and her father would have a heart attack if he even knew she was being faced with the question. And she knew then, as Harry and Dumbledore had both tried to warn her, that everything she'd ever thought about being a heroine had been mistaken, that there wasn't really any such thing as heroes outside of stories. There was just horrible danger, and being arrested by auras and put in cells next to Dementors, pain and fear, and Miss Granger, said the defense professor. She said nothing. All the words were blocked in her throat. "I need a decision, Miss Granger." She kept her jaw locked, didn't let any words come out. Finally, the defense professor sighed. Slowly, the white light failed, and slowly the door behind him swung open so that he was once again a black silhouette against the opening. "Good night, Miss Granger," he said, and turned his back to her and walked away into Hogwarts. It took a while for her breathing to slow down again. Whatever had happened here tonight, it didn't feel anything like victory. She'd fought so hard just to stop herself from saying yes in the face of the defense professor's pressure, and now she didn't even know if she'd done the right thing. When she walked back into the light herself, after exhaustion had overtaken everything and sleep was once more a possibility, she thought she heard it as she was within the doorway, from behind her and above her, a distant cawing cry. But it wasn't meant for her, she knew, so she started climbing up the stairs toward her dorm room. The other girls were probably asleep by now and wouldn't look at her or look away. She felt the tears start, and this time she didn't stop them. 85. Taboo Trade-Offs, Aftermath 3, Distance. This chapter received a major, significant revision on December 16, 2012. The main revision starts about halfway through search on the word trivial to find it. Slow and hard, the long stairway that led to the peak of Ravenclaw. From the inside, the stairway seemed like a straight upward slope, though from the outside you could see that it logically had to be a spiral. You could only get to the top of the Ravenclaw Tower by making that long climb without shortcuts, stone step by stone step, passing beneath Harry's shoes, pushed down by his wearying legs. Harry had seen Hermione safely off to bed. He had lingered in the Ravenclaw common room long enough to collect a few signatures that might be useful to Hermione later. Not many students had signed. Wizards hadn't been trained to think in the put up or shut up, stick your neck out and make a prediction or start pretending to believe in your theory rules of Muggle science. Most of them hadn't seen anything incongruent about being too nervous to sign an agreement saying that Hermione got to hold it over them for the rest of their lives if they were wrong, while acting outwardly confident that she was guilty. But just having demanded the signatures would make the point after the truth came out if anyone ever again suspected Hermione of anything dark. She wouldn't have to go through this twice, at least. After that, Harry had left the common room quickly, because all the kindly, forgiving sentiments he'd reasoned out were getting harder and harder to remember. Sometimes Harry thought the deepest split in his personality wasn't anything to do with his dark side. Rather, it was the divide between the altruistic and forgiving abstract reasoning Harry versus the frustrated and angry Harry in the moment. The circular platform at the top of the Ravenclaw Tower wasn't the tallest place in Hogwarts, but the Ravenclaw Tower jutted out from the main body of the castle, so you couldn't see down into the top platform from the astronomy tower. A quiet place to think if you had an awful lot to think about. A place where few other students ever came. There were easier niches of privacy, if privacy was all you wanted. The nightlit torches of Hogwarts were far below. The platform itself offered few obstructions. The stairs emerged from an uncovered gap in the floor rather than an upright door. From this place, then, the stars were as visible as they ever were on Earth. The boy lay down in the center of the platform, heedless of his robes that might be dirtied, dropping his head to rest upon the rock-tiled floor, so that, except for a few half-seen crenellations of stone at vision's edge and a sliver of crescent moon, reality became starlight. The pinpoints of light in dark velvet twinkled, wavering and returning, a different kind of beauty from their steady brilliance in the silent night. Harry gazed out abstractly, his mind on other things. This day your war against Voldemort has begun. Dumbledore had said that, after the incident with rescuing Bellatrix from Azkaban. That had been a false alarm, but the phrase expressed the sentiment well. 2 nights ago his war had begun, and Harry didn't know with who. Dumbledore thought it was Lord Voldemort, returned from the dead, making his first move against the boy who had defeated him last time. Professor Quirrell had put detection wards on Draco, fearing that Hogwarts's mad headmaster would try to frame Harry for the death of Lucius's son. Or Professor Quirrell had set up the entire thing, and that was how he'd known where to find Draco. Severus Snape thought the Hogwarts defense professor was an obvious suspect, even the obvious suspect. And Severus Snape himself might, or might not be even remotely trustworthy. Someone had declared war against Harry. Their first strike had been meant to take out Draco and Hermione both, and it was only by the barest of margins that Harry had saved Hermione. You couldn't call it victory. Draco had been removed from Hogwarts, and if that wasn't death, it wasn't clear how it could be undone, or what shape Draco might be in when he got back. The country of magical Britain now thought Hermione an attempted murderer, which might or might not make her decide to do the same thing and leave. Harry had sacrificed his entire fortune to undo his loss, and that card could only be played once. Some unknown power had struck at him, and if that blow had been partially deflected, it had still hit really hard. At least his dark side hadn't asked anything of him in exchange for saving Hermione. Maybe because his dark side wasn't an imaginary voice like Hufflepuff. Harry might imagine his Hufflepuff part as wanting different things from himself, but his dark side wasn't like that. His dark side, so far as Harry could tell, was a different way that Harry sometimes was. Right now, Harry wasn't angry, and trying to ask what dark Harry wanted was a phone ringing unanswered. The thought even seemed a little strange. Could you owe something to a different way you sometimes were? Harry stared up at the random stars, the scattered, twinkling lights that human brains couldn't help but pattern match into imaginary constellations. And then there was that promise Harry had sworn. Draco to help Harry reform Slytherin House, and Harry to take as an enemy whomever Harry believed, in his best judgment as a rationalist, to have killed Narcissa Malfoy. If Narcissa had never gotten her own hands dirty, if indeed she'd been burned alive, if the killer hadn't been tricked, those were all the conditions Harry could remember making. He probably should have written it down, or better yet, never made a promise requiring that many caveats in the first place. There were plausible outs, for the sort of person who'd let themselves rationalize an out. Dumbledore hadn't actually confessed. He hadn't come right out and said he'd done it. There were plausible reasons for an actually guilty Dumbledore to behave that way. But it was also what you'd expect to see if someone else had burned Narcissa and Dumbledore had taken credit. Harry shook his head, flattening one side of his hair and then another against the stone-tiled floor. There was still a final out. Draco could still release him from the oath at any time. He could, at least, describe the situation to Draco and talk about options with him when they met again. It didn't seem like a very likely prospect for release, but the idea of talking something over honestly was enough to satisfy the part of himself that demanded adherence to oaths. Even if it only meant delaying, it was better than taking a good man as an enemy. But is Dumbledore a good man? Asked the voice of Hufflepuff. If Dumbledore burned someone alive, wasn't the whole point that good people may kill, but never kill with suffering? Maybe he killed her instantly, said Slytherin, and then lied to Lucius about the burning alive part. But if there was any possibility of the Death Eaters magically verifying how Narcissa died, and if being caught in a lie would have endangered light-side families, be careful what we cleverly rationalize, warned Gryffindor. You have to expect reputational effects on how other people treat you, said Hufflepuff. If you decide there's sufficient reason to burn a woman alive, one of the predictable side effects is that good people decide you've crossed the line and have to be stopped. Dumbledore should have expected that. He's got no right to complain. Or maybe he expects us to be smarter, said Slytherin. Now that we know this much of the truth, no matter the exact details of the full story, can we really believe that Dumbledore is a terrible, terrible person who ought to be our enemy? In the middle of a horrible bloody war, Dumbledore set one enemy civilian on fire. That's only bad by the standards of comic books, not by any sort of realistic historical standard. Harry stared up at the night sky, remembering history. In real life, in real wars. During World War II, there had been a project to sabotage the Nazi nuclear weapons program. Years earlier, Leo Szilard, the first person to realize the possibility of a fission chain reaction, had convinced Fermi not to publish the discovery that purified graphite was a cheap and effective neutron moderator. Fermi had wanted to publish, for the sake of the great international project of science, which was above nationalism. But Szilard had persuaded Rabbi, and Fermi had abided by the majority vote of their tiny three-person conspiracy. And so, years later, the only neutron moderator the Nazis had known about was deuterium. The only deuterium source under Nazi control had been a captured facility in occupied Norway, which had been knocked out by bombs and sabotage, causing a total of 24 civilian deaths. The Nazis had tried to ship the deuterium already refined to Germany aboard a civilian Norwegian ferry, the SS Hydro. Nut Hockelid and his assistants had been discovered by the night watchman of the civilian ferry while they were sneaking on board to sabotage it. Hockelid had told the watchman that they were escaping the Gestapo, and the watchman had let them go. Hockelid had considered warning the night watchman, but that would have endangered the mission, so Hockelid had only shaken his hand. And the civilian ship had sunk in the deepest part of the lake, with 8 dead Germans, 7 dead crew, and 3 dead civilian bystanders. Some of the Norwegian rescuers of the ship had thought the German soldiers present should be left to drown, but this view had not prevailed, and the German survivors had been rescued. And that had been the end of the Nazi nuclear weapons program, which was to say that Nut Hockelid had killed innocent people, one of whom, the night watchman of the ship, had been a good person, someone who'd gone out of his way to help Hockelid, at risk to himself, from the kindness of his heart, for the highest moral reasons, and been sent to drown in turn. Afterward, in the cold light of history, it had looked like the Nazis had never been close to getting nuclear weapons after all, and Harry had never read anything suggesting that Hockelid had acted wrongly. That was war in real life. In terms of total damage and who'd gotten hit, what Hockelid had done was considerably worse than what Dumbledore might have done to Narcissa Malfoy, or what Dumbledore had possibly done to leak the prophecy to Lord Voldemort to get him to attack Harry's parents. If Hockelid had been a comic book superhero, he'd have somehow gotten all the civilians off the ferry. He would have attacked the German soldiers directly, rather than let a single innocent person die. But Nut Hockelid hadn't been a superhero, and neither had been Albus Dumbledore. Harry closed his eyes, swallowing hard a few times against the sudden choking sensation. It was abruptly very clear that while Harry was going around trying to live the ideals of the Enlightenment, Dumbledore was the one who'd actually fought in a war. Nonviolent ideals were cheap to hold if you were a scientist, living inside the Protego bubble cast by the police officers and soldiers whose actions you had the luxury to question. Albus Dumbledore seemed to have started out with ideals at least as strong as Harry's own, if not stronger, and Dumbledore hadn't gotten through his war without killing enemies and sacrificing friends. Are you so much better than Hockelid and Dumbledore, Harry Potter, that you'll be able to fight without a single casualty? Even in the world of comic books, the only reason a superhero like Batman even looks successful is that the comic book readers only notice when important named characters die, not when the Joker shoots some random, nameless bystander to show off his villainy. Batman is a murderer no less than the Joker, for all the lives the Joker took that Batman could have saved by killing him. That's what the man named Alistair was trying to tell Dumbledore, and afterward Dumbledore regretted having taken so long to change his mind. Are you really going to try to follow the path of the superhero and never sacrifice a single piece or kill a single enemy? Fatigued, Harry turned his attention away from the dilemma for a moment, opened his eyes again to regard the hemisphere of night, which required no decisions from him. Near the edge of his vision, the pale white crescent of the moon, the light from which had left 1¼ seconds ago, around 375,000 kilometers of distance in Earth's space of simultaneity. Above and to the side, Polaris, the North Star, the first star Harry had learned to identify in the sky by following the edge of the Big Dipper. That was actually a 5-star system with a brilliant central supergiant, 434 light-years from Earth. It was the first star, whose name Harry had ever learned from his father, so long ago that he couldn't have guessed how old he'd been. The dim fog that was the Milky Way, so many billions of distant stars that they became an indistinct river, the plain of a galaxy that stretched 100,000 light-years across. If Harry had experienced any sense of wonder when he'd first been told that, he'd been too young for him to remember now that first time, across a few years' distance. In the center of the constellation Andromeda, the star Andromeda, which was really the Andromeda Galaxy, the nearest galaxy to the Milky Way, 24 million light-years away, containing an estimated trillion stars. Numbers like those made infinity pale by comparison, because infinity was just featureless and blank. Thinking that the stars were infinitely distant was a lot less scary than trying to work out what 24 million light-years amounted to in meters. 24 million light-years, times 31 million seconds in a year, times a photon moving at 300 million meters per second. It was strange to think that such distances might not be unreachably far away. Magic was loose in the universe, things like time turners and broomsticks. Had any wizard ever tried to measure the speed of a portkey or a phoenix? And the human understanding of magic couldn't possibly be anywhere near the underlying laws. What would you be able to do with magic if you really understood it? A year ago, Dad had gone to the Australian National University in Canberra for a conference where he'd been an invited speaker, and he'd taken Mum and Harry along. And they'd all visited the National Museum of Australia, because, it had turned out, there was basically nothing else to do in Canberra. The glass display cases had shown rock throwers crafted by the Australian Aborigines like giant wooden shoehorns. They'd looked, but smoothed and carved and ornamented with painstaking care. In the 40,000 years since anatomically modern humans had migrated to Australia from Asia, nobody had invented the bow and arrow. It really made you appreciate how non-obvious was the idea of progress. Why would you even think of invention as something important if all your history's heroic tales were of great warriors and defenders instead of Thomas Edison? How could anyone have suspected, while carving a rock thrower with painstaking care, that someday human beings would invent rocket ships and nuclear energy? Could you have looked up into the sky at the brilliant light of the sun and deduced that the universe contained greater sources of power than mere fire? Would you have realized that if the fundamental physical laws permitted it, someday humans would tap the same energies as the sun? Even if nothing you could imagine doing with rock throwers or woven pouches, no pattern of running across the savannah, and nothing you could obtain by hunting animals would accomplish that even in imagination. It wasn't like modern-day muggles had gotten anywhere near the limits of what muggle physics said was possible. And yet, like hunter-gatherers conceptually bound to their rock throwers, most muggles lived in a world defined by the limits of what you could do with cars and telephones. Even though muggle physics explicitly permitted possibilities like molecular nanotechnology or the Penrose process for extracting energy from black holes, most people filed that away in the same section of their brain that stored fairy tales and history books, well away from their personal realities. Long ago and far away, ever so long ago. No surprise, then, that the wizarding world lived in a conceptual universe bounded, not by fundamental laws of magic that nobody even knew, but just by the surface rules of known charms and enchantments. You couldn't observe the way magic was practiced nowadays and not be reminded of the National Museum of Australia once you realized what you were seeing. Even if Harry's first guess had been mistaken, one way or another, it was still inconceivable that the fundamental laws of the universe contained a special case for human lips shaping the phrase Wingardium Leviosa. And yet, even that fumbling grasp of magic was enough to do things that Muggle physics said should be forever impossible. The time turner, water conjured out of nothingness by Aguamenti. What were the ultimate possibilities of invention if the underlying laws of the universe permitted an 11-year-old with a stick to violate almost every constraint in the Muggle version of physics, like a hunter-gatherer trying to look up at the sun and guess that the universe had to be shaped in a way that allowed for nuclear energy? It made you wonder if maybe 20,000 million meters wasn't so much distance after all. There was a step beyond abstract reasoning Harry which he could take, given time enough to compose himself and the right surroundings. Something beyond abstract reasoning Harry, as that was beyond Harry in the moment. Looking up at the stars, you could try to imagine what the distant descendants of humanity would think of your dilemma in 100 million years, when the stars would have spun through great galactic movements into entirely new positions, every constellation scattered. It was an elementary theorem of probability that if you knew what your answer would be after updating on future evidence, you ought to adopt that answer right now. If you knew your destination, you were already there. And by analogy, if not quite by theorem, if you could guess what the descendants of humanity would think of something, you ought to go ahead and take that as your own best guess. From that vantage point, the idea of killing off two-thirds of the Wisengamot seemed a lot less appealing than it had a few hours earlier. Even if you had to do it, even if you knew for a solid fact that it would be the best thing for magical Britain, and that the complete story of time would look worse if you didn't do it. Even as a necessity, the deaths of sentient beings would still be a tragedy. One more element of the sorrows of Earth, the most ancient Earth from which everything had begun, long ago and far away, ever so long ago. He's not like Grindelwald. There is nothing human left in him. Him you must destroy. Save your fury for that, and that alone. Harry shook his head slightly, tilting the stars a little in his vision, as he lay on the stone floor looking upward and outward and forward in time. Even if Dumbledore was right, and the true enemy was utterly mad and evil. In 100 million years, the organic life form known as Lord Voldemort probably wouldn't seem much different from all the other bewildered children of ancient Earth. Whatever Lord Voldemort had done to himself, whatever dark rituals seemed so horribly irrevocable on a merely human scale, it wouldn't be beyond curring with the technology of 100 million years. Killing him, even if you had to do it to save the lives of others, would be just one more death for future sentient beings to be sad about. How could you look up at the stars and believe anything else? Harry stared up at the twinkling lights of eternity and wondered what the children's children's children would think of what Dumbledore had maybe done to Narcissa. Even if you tried framing the question that way, asking what humanity's descendants would think, it still drew only on your own knowledge, not theirs. The answer still came from inside yourself, and it could still be mistaken. If you didn't know the 100th decimal digit of pi yourself, then you didn't know how the children's children's children would calculate it, for all that the fact was trivial. Slowly, he'd been lying there, looking at the stars, for longer than he'd planned. Harry sat up from the ground. Pushing himself to his feet, the muscles protesting, he walked over to the edge of the stone platform at the height of the Ravenclaw Tower. The stone crenellations surrounding the edge of the tower weren't high, not high enough to be safe. They were markers, clearly, rather than railings. Harry didn't approach too close to the edge. There was no point in taking chances. Looking down at the Hogwarts grounds below, he was predictably feeling a sense of dizziness, the wobbly affliction called vertigo. His brain was alarmed, it seemed, because the ground below was so distant. It might have been fully 50 meters away. The lesson, it seemed, was that things had to be incredibly close by before your brain could comprehend them well enough to feel fear. It was a rare brain that could feel strongly about anything if it wasn't close in space, close in time, near at hand, within easy reach. Before, Harry had imagined that going to Azkaban would require planning and cooperation from a grown-up Confederate. Portkeys, broomsticks, invisibility spells, some way of getting to the bottom levels without the Aurors noticing, so he could carve his way into the central pit where the shadows of death waited. And that had been enough to put the prospect away, into the future, safely apart from the now. He hadn't realized until today that it might be as simple as finding Fawkes and telling the Phoenix that it was time. Memories were rising up again, memories that Harry could never manage to forget for long. Though the stones beneath his feet were not smooth like metal, though the moonlit sky stretched all around him, somehow it was very easy to imagine himself trapped in a long metal corridor lit by dim orange light. The night was quiet, quiet enough for memories to be clearly audible. "No, I didn't mean it. Please don't die. No, I didn't mean it. Please don't die. Don't take it away. Don't." The world blurred, and Harry wiped his eyes with his sleeve. If Hermione had been the one behind that door, if Hermione had been put in Azkaban, Harry would have called the Phoenix and gone there and burned away every last Dementor, and it wouldn't have made a single difference how crazy it was or what else he'd wanted to do with his life. That was just how it was. And the woman who was behind that door, wasn't there someone somewhere to whom she too was precious? Wasn't it only Harry's distance from her life that was preventing his brain from being driven to Azkaban to save her no matter what? What would it have taken to compel him? Would he have needed to know her face, her name, her favorite color? Would he have been driven to Azkaban to save Tracy Davis? Would he have been compelled there to save Professor McGonagall? Mum and Dad, there wasn't even any question. And that woman had said she was someone's mother. How many people had wished for the power to break Azkaban? How many prisoners of Azkaban dreamed nightly of such a miraculous rescue? None. It's a happy thought. Maybe he should harrow Azkaban. All he had to do was find Fawkes and tell him it was time. Visualize the center of the Dementor's pit as he'd seen it from the broomstick and let the Phoenix take him there. Cast the true Patronus charm at point-blank range and to hell with what came after. All he had to do was go find Fawkes. It might be as simple as thinking of the flame, calling for the firebird in his heart. A star flashed in the night. By the time Harry's eyes had jumped with a reflex action trained on meteor showers, another part of him was surprised that the astronomical phenomenon was still there, a faint star whose brightness was slowly, visibly waxing. There was a startled moment when Harry wondered whether he was seeing not a meteor, but a nova or supernova. Could you see them getting brighter like that? Was the first stage of a nova supposed to be that yellow-orange color? Then the new star moved again and seemed to grow as well as brightening. It looked closer suddenly, no longer so far away that distance became moot, like what you thought was a star, turning out to be an airplane, a lighted form whose shape you could actually see. No, not a plane. The realization seemed to spread out from Harry's chest in a wave of prickling, sweat preparing to break out. A bird. A piercing cry split the night, echoing from the rooftops of Hogwarts. The approaching creature trailed fire as it flew, shedding golden flames like sparks from its feathers as the mighty wings beat and beat again. Even as it swooped up in a great curve to hover a few paces away from Harry, even as the flames surrounding its passage diminished, the creature seemed no dimmer, no less bright, as though some unseen sun shone upon it and illuminated it. Great shining wings red like a sunset, and eyes like incandescent pearls, blazing with golden fire and determination. The phoenix's beak opened and let out a great call that Harry understood as though it had been a spoken word. Come! Not even realizing, the boy stumbled back from the edge of the rooftop, eyes still locked on the phoenix, his whole body trembling and tensed, his fists clutching and releasing at his side, stepping back, stepping away. The phoenix cawed again, a desperate, pleading sound. It didn't come through in words this time, but it came through in feelings, an echo of everything that Harry had ever felt about Azkaban and every temptation to action, to just do something about it, the desperate need to do something now and not delay any longer, all spoken in the cry of a bird. Let's go. It's time. The voice that spoke came from inside Harry, not from the phoenix, from so deep inside it couldn't be given a separate name like Gryffindor. All he had to do was step forward and touch the phoenix's talons, and it would take him where he needed to be, where he kept thinking he ought to be, down into the central pit of Azkaban. Harry could see the image in his mind, shining with unbearable clarity, the image of himself suddenly smiling with joyous release as he threw all his fears away and chose. But Harry whispered, not even aware of what he was saying. Harry lifted his shaking hands to wipe at his eyes from which tears had sprung as the phoenix hovered before him with great wing sweeps. But there's other people I also have to save, other things I have to do. The firebird let out a piercing scream, and the boy flinched back as though from a blow. It wasn't a command, it wasn't an objection, it was the knowledge, the corridors lit by dim orange light. It felt like a tightening compulsion in Harry's chest, the desire to just do it and get it over with. He might die, but if he didn't die, he could feel clean again, have principles that were more than excuses for inaction. It was his life, his to spend if he chose. He could do it any time he wanted. If he wasn't a good person. The boy stood there on the rooftop, his own eyes locked with 2 points of fire. The stars might have had time to shift in their constellations while he stood there, agonizing over the decision. That wouldn't change. The boy's eyes flickered once to the stars above, and then he looked at the phoenix. Not yet, the boy said in a voice hardly audible. Not yet. There's too much else I have to do. Please come back later, when I've found others who can cast the true Patronus in 6 months. Maybe. Without word, without sound, a sphere of fire surrounded the bird's form, crackling and blazing with white and crimson veins, as though it meant to consume that which lay within. And when the fire dispersed into grey smoke, no phoenix remained. There was silence on the top of the Ravenclaw Tower. The boy gradually lowered his hands from his ears, pausing only to wipe at his wet cheeks. Slowly the boy turned, then cried out and leapt back and almost fell off the Ravenclaw Tower, though the misstep would hardly have mattered, with that other wizard standing there. And so it was done, Albus Dumbledore said, almost in a whisper. So it was done. Fawkes was on his shoulder, staring at where the other phoenix had been with an indecipherable avian gaze. What are you doing here? Said the ancient man, standing on the roof platform's opposite corner. I felt the presence of a creature Hogwarts did not know, and came to see, of course. Slowly, the old wizard's shaking hand came up to remove the half-moon glasses, His other hand wiped at his eyes and forehead with his robe's sleeve. I dared not speak. I knew this choice above all choices must be your own. A strange apprehension was beginning to fill Harry, welling up in him like a sick feeling in his stomach. Everything depended on this, Albus Dumbledore said, still in that almost whisper. That much I knew, but which choice led into darkness that I could not guess. At least the choice was your own. I don't, Harry said, and then his voice stopped. A terrible hypothesis, rising in credibility. The Phoenix comes, said the old wizard. To those who would fight, to those who would act even at cost of their lives, the Phoenix comes. Phoenixes are not wise, Harry. They know no means to judge us, save witnessing the choice. I thought it was to my death I went, when the Phoenix took me to fight Grindelwald. I did not know that Fawkes would sustain me and heal me and stay by my side. The old wizard's voice quavered for a moment. It is not spoken of, you should realize, Harry, why it is never spoken of if the one knew the Phoenix could not judge. But to you, Harry, I may say it now, for the Phoenix comes only once. The old wizard walked across the top of the Ravenclaw Tower to where a boy stood rooted in dawning horror, in dawning and utter horror. In my duel with Grindelwald, I could not win, only fight him for long hours until he collapsed in exhaustion, and I would have died of it afterward, if not for Fawkes. Harry didn't even know he was speaking, until the whisper had escaped him. Then I could have. Could you have? Said the ancient wizard, his voice sounding far older than his normal tones. 3 times now, a Phoenix has come for my student. One did send hers away, and the grief of it broke her, I think. And the last was cousin to your young friend Lavender Brown, and he, the old wizard's voice cracked. He did not return, did poor John, and he saved none of those he meant to save. It is said, among the few scholars of Phoenix lore, that not 1 in 4 returns from their ordeal. And even if you did survive, for the life you must lead, Harry James Potter Evansvares, the choices you must make, and the path you must walk, to always hear the Phoenix's cries, who is to say it would not have driven you mad. The old wizard raised his sleeve again, drawing it once more across his face. I had more joy of Fawkes's companionship in the days before I fought Voldemort. The boy did not seem to be listening. All his eyes were on the red-gold bird on the ancient wizard's shoulder. Fawkes, the boy said in shaking voice. Why won't you look at me, Fawkes? Fawkes craned his head to peer at the boy curiously, then turned back and resumed gazing at his master. See, said the old wizard. He does not reject you. Fawkes may not be interested in you in quite that way now, and he knows, the wizard smiled wryly, that you are not exactly loyal to his master. But one to whom the Phoenix comes at all cannot be one whom a Phoenix would dislike. The wizard's voice fell to a whisper again. There never was a bird seen on Godric Gryffindor's shoulder. Though it is not written even in his secrets, I think he must have sent his Phoenix away before he chose the red and gold for his colors. Perhaps the guilt of it urged him to greater lengths than he ever would have dared otherwise, or it might have taught him humility and respect for human frailty and failure. The wizard bowed his head. I truly do not know if your choice was wise. I truly do not know if it was the right thing or the wrong thing. If I knew, Harry, I would have spoken. But Dumbledore's voice broke then. I am nothing but a foolish young boy who has become a foolish old man, and I have no wisdom. Harry couldn't breathe, the nausea seeming to fill and overflow his whole body, stomach locked solid. He was suddenly and terribly certain that he had failed, in some final sense failed this very night. The boy whirled, and ran out to the curb of the Ravenclaw rooftop. Come back, his voice cracked, rising to a shriek. Come back. Final aftermath. She came awake with a gasp of horror. She woke with an unvoiced scream on her lips, and no words came forth. She could not understand what she had seen. She could not understand what she had seen. What time is it? She whispered. Her golden jeweled alarm clock whispered back, around 11 at night. Go back to sleep. Her sheets were soaked in sweat, her nightclothes soaked in sweat. She took her wand from beside the pillow and cleaned herself up before she tried to go back to sleep, and eventually succeeded. Sybil Trelawney went back to sleep. In the forbidden forest, a centaur woken by a nameless apprehension ceased scanning the night sky, having found only questions there and no answers, and with a folding of his many legs, Forenza went back to sleep. In the distant lands of magical Asia, an ancient witch named Fan Tong, sleeping the tired days away, told her anxious great-great-grandson that she was fine. It had only been a nightmare. and went back to sleep. In a land where Muggleborns received no letters of any kind, a girl child too young to have a name of her own was rocked in the arms of her annoyed but loving mother until she stopped crying and went back to sleep. None of them slept well.